Imagine a building that contained everything humanity had ever learned. Every scientific discovery, every philosophical insight, every poem and play and mathematical proof, every medical treatment, every map of every land, every history of every civilization. Imagine that building burning, and all of that knowledge turning to ash and smoke lost forever, setting human progress back by centuries, perhaps by 1,000 years. That building existed. It was called the Library of Alexandria, and what happened to it remains one of the greatest tragedies in human history. If you're settling in for the night, this is exactly the kind of story that works perfectly for sleep. Long, slow, full of ancient history and profound mystery. If you enjoy it, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next journey into forgotten history. And if you want to tell me where you're listening from tonight, drop a comment. I love knowing that someone in Cairo and someone in London and someone in a small town in Kansas are all drifting off to the same ancient mysteries together. Now let's travel back more than 2,000 years to a time when the world was younger and knowledge was rare and precious, when a single library could contain more wisdom than most civilizations would ever produce. Let's talk about what we built, what we lost, and what it means for all of us. The story of the Library of Alexandria begins with a conqueror and a dream. Alexander the Great, the Macedonian king who conquered most of the known world before his 30th birthday, founded the city of Alexandria in 331 BCE. He chose the location carefully, a strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and a lake called Mareotis, positioned perfectly for trade between Greece, Egypt, and the wider world. Alexander never saw his city completed. He died in Babylon 8 years later, his empire fragmenting among his generals, his dreams of unity dying with him. But the city that bore his name would become something greater than even he had imagined. It would become the intellectual capital of the ancient world, and at its heart would stand the greatest library ever built. After Alexander's death, his general Ptolemy took control of Egypt and made Alexandria his capital. Ptolemy was not just a soldier. He was an educated man, a student of philosophy and science, someone who understood that knowledge was a form of power more enduring than any army. He wanted Alexandria to be more than a trading port. He wanted it to be a centre of learning that would attract the greatest minds from across the known world. To achieve this vision, Ptolemy and his successors created an institution called the Mouseion, which means Temple of the Muses. This was not a museum in the modern sense, but something more like a university, a place where scholars could live, work, study, and teach without worrying about money or politics or the practical concerns of ordinary life. The Mouseion provided housing, food, salaries, and most importantly, access to the greatest collection of written knowledge ever assembled. That collection was the Library of Alexandria. Understanding what the library meant requires understanding how rare books were in the ancient world. There was no printing press. Every book was copied by hand, letter by letter, a process that could take months for a single volume. Books were incredibly expensive, owned only by the wealthy or by institutions with substantial resources. Most people never touched a book in their entire lives. In this context, a library was not just a collection of books. It was a concentration of power, a statement that a civilization valued knowledge enough to invest enormous resources in preserving and expanding it. The Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt made this investment on a scale that had never been attempted before. They wanted Alexandria to possess every book in existence. The methods they used to build this collection range from generous to ruthless. Scholars were encouraged to bring their own books to Alexandria, where they would be copied and returned. The copies stayed in the library, gradually building the collection. But this voluntary approach was not fast enough for the Ptolemies. They instituted a law requiring every ship that entered Alexandria's harbour to surrender any books on board. The books were taken to the library, copied, and the copies were returned to their owners, while the originals remained in Alexandria. Ship captains learned to hide their books or avoid the port entirely, but enough was seized to significantly expand the collection. The Ptolemies also sent agents throughout the Mediterranean world to buy or copy books wherever they could be found. Athens, which had been the intellectual centre of Greece for centuries, was a particular target. Agents purchased private libraries, copied temple archives, and even borrowed irreplaceable original manuscripts with promises to return them, only to return copies and keep the originals for Alexandria. One famous story involves the official Athenian copies of the plays of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. These were the definitive texts, carefully preserved by the Athenian state. The Ptolemies borrowed them, supposedly to make copies, putting up an enormous deposit as guarantee of their return. They then kept the originals and forfeited the deposit, considering the authentic manuscripts worth more than any amount of money. This story might be exaggerated or invented, but it captures the spirit of Alexandrian book collecting. No expense was too great, no method too extreme when it came to acquiring knowledge. The library grew until it contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls. The exact number is uncertain, because ancient sources give different figures and we cannot be sure what they were counting. Some estimates suggest the library held between 200,000 and 700,000 scrolls at its peak. Even the lower estimate would make it by far the largest library in the ancient world, larger than anything that would exist again until the modern era. But raw numbers don't capture what the library truly contained. This was not just a large collection of random books. It was a systematic attempt to gather all human knowledge into one place. The library held works of philosophy from every Greek school of thought. It held mathematical treatises that would remain unsurpassed for centuries. It held medical texts describing treatments and surgical techniques. It held astronomical observations and theories about the nature of the cosmos. It held histories of every civilization the Greeks had encountered. It held poetry and drama and literary criticism. It held maps and geographic descriptions of lands from Britain to India. It held religious texts from Egypt, Babylon, Persia, and Judea. The Jewish scriptures were translated into Greek at Alexandria, creating the Septuagint that would become the basis for Christian Old Testament texts. This translation project alone involved bringing Jewish scholars to Alexandria and supporting them while they worked for years on the massive undertaking. The library didn't just collect books, it organised them. A scholar named Callimachus created a catalogue called the Pinaches, essentially the first library catalogue in history. This was not a simple list, but a comprehensive bibliography, organised by subject, author and title, with notes about each work's contents and authenticity. The Pinax itself ran to 120 scrolls, a massive reference work that made the library's collection actually usable rather than just impressive. The scholars who worked at the Mouseion and library represented the finest minds of the ancient world. Euclid wrote his Elements of Geometry there, a work so foundational that it remained the standard geometry textbook for over 2,000 years. Archimedes studied there before returning to Syracuse, where he would become the greatest engineer and mathematician of antiquity. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth using nothing but shadows and geometry, arriving at a figure remarkably close to the actual value. Aristarchus proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun, 18 centuries before Copernicus. Herophilus and Erasistratus performed systematic dissections of human bodies, advancing anatomical knowledge beyond what would be achieved again until the Renaissance. Apollonius wrote the definitive ancient work on conic sections, mathematics that would eventually be essential for understanding planetary orbits and designing everything from bridges to satellite dishes. Hipparchus created star catalogues and discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble of Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete one cycle. These discoveries were not isolated achievements. They built on each other, each generation of scholars starting where the previous generation left off, creating a continuous tradition of inquiry that accelerated human understanding at a pace the world had never seen. The library made this possible by preserving knowledge across generations, allowing each new scholar to begin with everything that had come before rather than starting from scratch. Consider what this meant in practical terms. A young mathematician arriving in Alexandria could read everything that had ever been written about geometry. He could study the original proofs, learn from the mistakes and insights of his predecessors, and then push forward into new territory. Without the library, he might spend his entire life rediscovering things that others had already found. With the library, he could focus on genuine advancement. This is why the library matters so much, and why its loss was so catastrophic. It was not just a building full of books. It was an engine of human progress, a mechanism for accumulating and transmitting knowledge that allowed civilization to advance faster than it ever had before. When the library was destroyed, that engine stopped. Knowledge that had been preserved for centuries was suddenly gone. Discoveries that could have been built upon were forgotten. Humanity had to start over, relearning things that had already been learned, rediscovering principles that had already been discovered, losing centuries of potential progress. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The library did not fall in a single dramatic moment. Its destruction was a long, slow process, a death by 1,000 cuts spread across centuries. And the full story of what happened and what was lost is more complicated and more heartbreaking than the simple image of a burning library might suggest. Let that thought settle into your mind as we continue deeper into this story. A library that contained everything, a light that illuminated the ancient world, and a darkness that swallowed it, slowly, inexorably, until nothing remained but fragments and memories and the enduring question of what might have been. To understand what the Library of Alexandria truly was, we need to understand what it contained, not just the number of scrolls, but the actual knowledge, the specific works and discoveries and ideas that were gathered there. Because when we talk about the library's destruction, we are not talking about an abstract loss. We are talking about specific books, specific ideas, specific pieces of human understanding that existed and then ceased to exist. The library's collection was organized into several categories, reflecting the Greek understanding of knowledge. There was poetry and drama, including works by hundreds of authors whose names we know, but whose writings are lost. There was philosophy, representing every school of thought, from the pre-Socratics to the Stoics and Epicureans. There was history, recording the rise and fall of civilizations from Egypt to Persia to the Greek city-states. There was natural philosophy, what we would call science, including astronomy, physics, biology, and medicine. There was mathematics and geometry, there was rhetoric and literary criticism, and there was a vast collection of practical knowledge, everything from agricultural techniques to military tactics to architectural principles. Consider just the category of drama. We know the names of approximately 150 Greek playwrights from the classical and Hellenistic periods. Of these, we have complete works from only 3: Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. And even for these 3, we have only a fraction of what they wrote. Aeschylus wrote between 70 and 90 plays, we have 7. Sophocles wrote over 120 plays, we have 7. Euripides wrote approximately 92 plays, we have 18, plus one that may or may not be his. That means we have lost approximately 90% of the work of the 3 greatest tragic playwrights in history. And for the other 147 playwrights whose names we know, we have essentially nothing. Fragments quoted by other authors, sometimes just a line or two, sometimes just a title. Imagine if 90% of Shakespeare's plays had been destroyed, and we could only read Hamlet and knew the other 36 plays only from scattered quotations. That is our situation with Greek tragedy. The library contained these lost plays. Scholars in Alexandria read them, studied them, wrote commentaries on them, and then they were gone. The same pattern repeats across every field of knowledge. We know that the philosopher Chrysippus wrote over 700 works. We have none of them, only fragments preserved in quotations by other authors. We know that the historian Timaeus wrote a comprehensive history of Sicily and the Western Mediterranean. We have only fragments. We know that the geographer Agatharchides wrote detailed accounts of the Red Sea region and the lands beyond. We have summaries and excerpts, but not the original work. In science, the losses are equally devastating. We have references to astronomical observations made at Alexandria over centuries, systematic records that would have been invaluable for understanding everything from planetary motion to the precession of the equinoxes. Most of these observations are lost. We have references to anatomical discoveries made through dissection, detailed descriptions of the human body that would not be equalled until the Renaissance. Most of these descriptions are lost. We have references to engineering treatises describing machines and mechanisms, the accumulated practical knowledge of one of the most technically sophisticated civilizations in the ancient world. Most of these treatises are lost. The mathematician Apollonius wrote 8 books on conic sections, the curves formed when a plane intersects a cone. These curves, the circle, ellipse, parabola, and hyperbola, turn out to be fundamental to understanding everything from planetary orbits to the trajectories of thrown objects to the design of satellite dishes and radio telescopes. We have the first 4 books of Apollonius in the original Greek. We have the next 3 books only in Arabic translation, preserved by Islamic scholars who recognized their value. The 8th book is completely lost. What was in that 8th book? We don't know. We never will know. It might have contained mathematical insights that would have advanced our understanding significantly. It might have been relatively routine. We have no way to tell because it no longer exists. This pattern of partial preservation is common. We have some of a work, enough to know that there was more, but the rest is gone. We have tantalizing references to ideas and discoveries that we cannot verify or build upon because the original sources have been destroyed. We are like archaeologists working with broken pottery, trying to reconstruct complete vessels from scattered shards, knowing that we will never see the original whole. The medical knowledge lost at Alexandria deserves particular attention. The physicians Herophilus and Erasistratus, working at the Malsion in the 3rd century BCE, conducted systematic dissections of human bodies, something that would not be done again in the Western world for over 1,000 years. They made discoveries about the nervous system, the circulatory system, the digestive system, and the structure of the brain that would not be rediscovered until the Renaissance. Herophilus wrote at least 9 books on anatomy and medicine. We have fragments quoted by later authors, enough to know that his work was groundbreaking, but the original texts are lost. We know he distinguished between sensory and motor nerves, identified the pulses originating from the heart, described the structure of the eye in detail, and made numerous other observations that were ahead of his time. But the details, the specific descriptions and careful observations that would have allowed his successors to build on his work, are gone. How many people died of treatable conditions because this medical knowledge was lost? How many centuries passed before physicians rediscovered what Herophilus already knew? These questions have no answers, but they suggest the human cost of the library's destruction. Knowledge that could have saved lives was lost, and people died as a result. The astronomical knowledge lost at Alexandria has equally profound implications. We know that Aristarchus of Samos proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system, with the Earth and other planets revolving around the Sun around 1800 years before Copernicus. His original work explaining this model is lost. We have only a summary by Archimedes and references by other authors. What evidence did Aristarchus present? What objections did he anticipate and answer? How close did he come to the correct understanding of planetary motion? We don't know because we don't have his book. Hipparchus, working at Alexandria in the 2nd century BCE, created detailed star catalogues and made observations of planetary positions over many years. These observations would have been invaluable for later astronomers trying to understand celestial mechanics. They would have provided a baseline stretching back centuries, allowing the detection of slow changes that cannot be observed within a single lifetime. Most of these observations are lost. When Tycho Brahe began his systematic observations in the 16th century CE, he was essentially starting over, without access to the accumulated data that Alexandria had collected. The mathematical works lost at Alexandria include not just the 8th book of Apollonius, but entire categories of mathematical thought that we can only glimpse through scattered references. We know that Alexandrian mathematicians worked on problems of algebra and number theory that would not be systematically addressed again until the Islamic Golden Age and beyond. We know they made progress on problems of calculation and approximation that are relevant to everything from engineering to physics to computer science, but the specific techniques they developed, the insights they achieved, are largely lost. Consider what this means for our understanding of ancient intellectual achievement. We tend to think of the ancient Greeks as brilliant philosophers but primitive scientists, strong on theory but weak on practical application. But this image may be distorted by what survived and what was lost. The philosophical works, copied by monks and scholars who found them spiritually or intellectually interesting, survived in greater proportion than the technical works, which were harder to understand and seemed less relevant to medieval concerns. The library contained both, but the destruction filtered out the technical knowledge more thoroughly than the philosophical speculation. We may be seeing ancient thought through a lens that makes it seem less scientific, less practical, less advanced than it actually was, simply because the scientific and practical works were more thoroughly destroyed. This brings us to the question of how the destruction happened, and why it happened, and whether it could have been prevented. The story is not simple. There was no single fire, no single villain, no single moment when the library was lost. Instead, there was a long decline, punctuated by several catastrophic events, each of which destroyed part of what remained until finally nothing was left. Let that complexity settle into your mind as we continue. The library did not die suddenly. It died slowly over centuries through a combination of accident, neglect, and deliberate destruction. And understanding how it died helps us understand what we lost and why it still matters. The first major catastrophe to strike the Library of Alexandria came in 48 BCE, when Julius Caesar found himself trapped in the city during his pursuit of his rival Pompey. The Roman Civil War had brought Caesar to Egypt, where he became embroiled in a local succession dispute between the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII and his sister Cleopatra. When Egyptian forces hostile to Caesar attacked, he found himself besieged in the palace district with a relatively small force, cut off from reinforcement and surrounded by enemies. To prevent the Egyptian fleet from being used against him, Caesar ordered his men to set fire to the ships in the harbour. The fire spread from the docks to the warehouses along the waterfront, and from there into the city. Ancient sources disagree about exactly what burned. Some say the library itself was destroyed. Others say only a warehouse containing books destined for export was lost. Still others say the fire damaged the library but did not completely destroy it. The truth is probably that the fire caused significant damage but did not end the library entirely. We know that the library continued to function after Caesar's time, that scholars still worked there, that books were still being collected and studied. But the fire of 48 BCE may have destroyed a substantial portion of the collection, perhaps tens of thousands of scrolls, an incalculable loss even if it was not the total destruction that some accounts suggest. The incident with Caesar illustrates a pattern that would repeat throughout the library's history. Alexandria was strategically important, wealthy, and frequently contested. When conflicts erupted, the library was vulnerable. It was not a fortified military installation, but a scholarly institution. Its buildings designed for study rather than defense. Its contents more valuable than any treasure, but far more fragile. Fire was the great enemy of ancient libraries. Scrolls made of papyrus were extremely flammable, and once a fire started in a collection of tightly rolled documents, it spread rapidly and was almost impossible to stop. A single torch, a single lamp knocked over, a single act of arson could destroy in hours what had taken centuries to accumulate. The scholars and librarians of Alexandria must have lived with constant awareness of this vulnerability. They must have taken precautions, storing particularly valuable manuscripts in secure locations, maintaining copies when possible, limiting access to open flames. But no precautions could fully protect against the chaos of war or the deliberate malice of those who saw the library as an enemy. After Caesar, the library continued to function, but it had lost its monopoly on learning. Rome was now the dominant power in the Mediterranean, and Roman scholars were less interested in supporting Alexandrian institutions than in building their own. The library's funding declined. Its ability to attract the best scholars diminished. It remained important, but it was no longer the unquestioned centre of the intellectual world. The next major catastrophe came in 272 CE, during the reign of the Roman Emperor Aurelian. A rebellion had broken out in Alexandria, led by a merchant named Firmus, who briefly declared himself Emperor of Egypt. Aurelian besieged the city and eventually captured it, but the fighting was intense and destructive. Ancient sources indicate that the Brucheium district, where the Museion and library were located, was heavily damaged during the siege and its aftermath. The extent of the damage is uncertain. Some historians believe the library was effectively destroyed at this point, with only scattered remnants surviving. Others argue that the main collection had already been dispersed, or that copies existed in other locations within the city. What seems clear is that after 272 CE, references to the library become much less frequent in ancient sources, suggesting that even if it survived in some form, it was no longer the major institution it had once been. But the destruction was not yet complete. Alexandria remained an important intellectual centre, particularly for the development of early Christianity. The city was home to the catechetical school of Alexandria, where Christian thinkers like Clement and Origen developed sophisticated theological and philosophical systems that would shape Christian thought for centuries. These scholars had access to classical texts, suggesting that libraries of some kind still existed in the city. The relationship between Christianity and the classical heritage preserved in Alexandrian libraries was complicated. On one hand, Christian scholars valued Greek philosophy and used it to develop their theological systems. On the other hand, many Christians were suspicious of pagan learning, seeing it as a distraction from or even a threat to religious truth. This tension would eventually contribute to the library's final destruction. The event most commonly associated with the library's end came in 391 CE, when the Christian patriarch Theophilus led a mob that destroyed the Serapeum, a temple complex that housed a daughter library, a secondary collection that had been established to handle overflow from the main library. The destruction of the Serapeum was part of a broader campaign against pagan institutions ordered by the Christian Emperor Theodosius. Temples were closed, sacrifices banned, and the ancient religious traditions of Egypt suppressed by force. The Serapeum was a particular target because it was both a pagan temple and a centre of learning associated with the Old Order. When Theophilus's followers destroyed the temple, they almost certainly destroyed whatever books it contained as well. Whether this represented a significant portion of the original library's collection, or merely a secondary collection of copies and lesser works, is debated by historians. By 391 CE, the main library may have been largely empty already, its contents dispersed, destroyed, or simply decayed from centuries of insufficient maintenance. Or the Serapeum may have held the last significant concentration of Alexandrian texts, making its destruction the final blow. We simply don't have enough evidence to know for certain. The most controversial destruction narrative involves the Arab conquest of Egypt in 641 CE. According to a story that appears in later Arab sources, the conquering general Amr ibn Alas wrote to the Caliph Omar asking what should be done with the books in Alexandria's libraries. Omar supposedly replied that if the books agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they disagreed with the Quran, they were harmful. Either way, they should be destroyed. According to this story, the books were distributed to the city's 4,000 bathhouses and used as fuel to heat the water. There were so many books that they kept the bathhouses supplied for 6 months. This story is almost certainly false, or at least greatly exaggerated. It first appears in sources written centuries after the conquest, and earlier Arab historians, who were generally proud of the Muslim conquest of Egypt and had no reason to suppress such a story, don't mention it at all. The story may have been invented to discredit a particular dynasty by associating their predecessors with the destruction of learning, or it may represent a confused memory of some actual destruction of books that was later attached to the famous library. Moreover, by 641 CE, there was probably very little left to destroy. The library had been declining for 6 centuries. It had suffered multiple catastrophes. The institutions that had supported it no longer existed. The scholars who had used it had dispersed to other centres of learning. The Arab conquerors almost certainly found a city that had long since lost its status as the intellectual capital of the ancient world, with whatever remained of its book collections scattered among various smaller libraries, private collections, and religious institutions. The truth is probably that the Library of Alexandria did not have a single dramatic ending. It died gradually over centuries through a combination of fire, war, neglect, and deliberate destruction. Each catastrophe took a portion of what remained. Each period of reduced funding allowed more scrolls to decay or be lost. Each shift in political and religious power changed priorities and redirected resources away from maintaining the collection. By the time anyone might have noticed that the library was truly gone, it had been declining so long that its loss was more whimper than bang. This gradual death makes the library's destruction harder to mourn in some ways. We want a clear villain, a single moment of loss, a dramatic story with heroes and villains. The reality is messier, more diffuse, more like the way most things are lost in history. But the gradual nature of the destruction also makes it more relevant to our own time. We face the same challenges today. Libraries and archives around the world are underfunded. Digital storage systems become obsolete, leaving data trapped in formats that can no longer be read. Political conflicts destroy cultural heritage in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. Climate change threatens coastal institutions with flooding and fire. The lesson of Alexandria is not just about one ancient library. It's about the fragility of human knowledge and the constant effort required to preserve it. The scholars who worked at the Library of Alexandria deserve to be remembered individually, because their achievements give concrete form to what was lost when the library fell. These were not abstract intellects producing dry academic work. They were humans solving real problems, driven by curiosity and ambition, creating knowledge that would shape the world for centuries and that in many cases has never been equalled or recovered. Euclid worked at Alexandria around 300 BCE, during the reign of Ptolemy I. His Elements of Geometry became the most successful textbook in history, used for over 2,000 years to teach mathematical reasoning. The book did not just present geometric facts, it demonstrated a method of logical argument, starting from a small number of self-evident axioms and deriving an entire system of knowledge through rigorous proof. This method would become the model for all scientific and mathematical reasoning. When Isaac Newton wrote his Principia Mathematica, he used Euclidean geometric proofs. When Abraham Lincoln wanted to understand what it meant to really prove something, he studied Euclid. When modern computer scientists developed formal verification systems for software, they built on principles first articulated in the Elements. Euclid's work survived because it was so useful that copies proliferated throughout the ancient world. But Euclid wrote other works that are lost. We have references to books on optics, on conic sections, on fallacies in geometric reasoning. These works presumably contained the same rigorous logical approach as the Elements, but applied to different subjects. What insights did they contain? What problems did they solve? We have no way to know because the books no longer exist. Archimedes studied at Alexandria before returning to his native Syracuse, where he became the greatest engineer and physicist of the ancient world. He calculated the value of pi with unprecedented precision. He determined the volumes and surface areas of spheres and cylinders. He discovered the principles of buoyancy and leverage that still bear his name. He invented war machines that held off the Roman army for years, including catapults, cranes that could lift ships out of the water, and possibly a system of mirrors that concentrated sunlight to set ships on fire. When the Romans finally captured Syracuse in 212 BCE, a soldier killed Archimedes despite orders that he be captured alive. According to legend, Archimedes was drawing geometric figures in the sand and told the soldier not to disturb his circles. The soldier, not recognizing him, cut him down. It was a metaphor for what would happen repeatedly in the centuries to come, military power destroying intellectual achievement through a combination of carelessness and contempt. Archimedes' works partially survived, copied and preserved through chains of transmission that passed through Alexandria, Constantinople, and the Islamic world before reaching medieval Europe. But we know he wrote more than we have. A palimpsest discovered in the 20th century, a parchment that had been scraped and reused, revealed portions of previously unknown Archimedean texts hidden beneath medieval prayers. What else has been lost, hidden in documents we haven't found or destroyed so completely that not even traces remain? Eratosthenes served as the chief librarian of Alexandria around 240 BCE, making him the person responsible for the greatest collection of knowledge in the ancient world. But he was more than an administrator. He was a polymath who made original contributions to mathematics, geography, astronomy, and literary criticism. His most famous achievement was calculating the circumference of the Earth using nothing but shadows, geometry, and logical reasoning. Eratosthenes knew that at noon on the summer solstice, the sun was directly overhead in the Egyptian city of Syene, modern Aswan. He measured the angle of the sun at Alexandria on the same day and found it to be about 7 degrees from vertical. He knew the distance between the two cities. From these facts, he calculated the Earth's circumference at approximately 250,000 stadia, a figure that, depending on which length we use for the stadium measurement, comes remarkably close to the modern value of about 40,000 kilometers. This calculation was not a lucky guess. It was rigorous science based on careful observation and mathematical reasoning. It demonstrated that the Greeks knew the Earth was round more than 17 centuries before Columbus, and they had a good estimate of its size. This knowledge was recorded in Alexandria's library. It was available to anyone who cared to look, and then it was lost, or at least became obscure enough that medieval Europeans could forget it. Aristarchus of Samos, who worked at Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun rather than the Sun around the Earth. We don't have his original work arguing for this heliocentric model. We have only references by other authors, particularly Archimedes, who described the theory in order to discuss its mathematical implications. We know Aristarchus presented arguments and evidence. We don't know what they were. For 1800 years, the heliocentric model was abandoned. Ptolemy's geocentric system, with the Earth at the centre of the universe, dominated Western and Islamic astronomy. When Copernicus finally revived the heliocentric idea in 1543, he was unaware of how close he was to ideas that had been proposed and then forgotten millennia earlier. How much faster might astronomy have progressed if Aristarchus's work had survived? How much sooner might we have understood the true nature of the solar system, the galaxy, the universe? These questions cannot be answered, but they hint at the magnitude of what was lost. Hipparchus of Nicaea worked at Alexandria in the 2nd century BCE, creating detailed star catalogues and making observations that would not be equalled for over 1,000 years. He discovered the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble in Earth's axis that causes the position of the celestial pole to trace a circle in the sky over about 26,000 years. This discovery required comparing observations made over long time periods, exactly the kind of work that a permanent institution like the library made possible. Hipparchus's star catalogue listed the positions and brightnesses of about 850 stars. It was the most comprehensive such catalogue until Tycho Brahe compiled his own in the late 16th century. But we don't have Hipparchus's original catalogue. We have only the version preserved and extended by Ptolemy in his Almagest, written 3 centuries later. What observations did Hipparchus make that Ptolemy chose not to include? What conclusions did he draw that later seemed less important but might have been valuable to us? We cannot know because the original work is lost. The physicians Herophilus and Erasistratus worked at Alexandria in the 3rd century BCE, taking advantage of a unique opportunity that would not come again for over 1,000 years. The Ptolemaic rulers, for reasons that remain somewhat mysterious, permitted and possibly encouraged the dissection of human bodies for scientific purposes. Some ancient sources claim that condemned criminals were vivisected, cut open while still alive to observe the functioning of living organs. This claim may be exaggeration or hostile propaganda, but what seems certain is that Herophilus and Erasistratus conducted systematic anatomical investigations that gave them detailed knowledge of the human body. Herophilus identified the brain as the seat of intelligence, contradicting Aristotle's view that the heart was the centre of thought and sensation. He distinguished between sensory nerves, which carry information to the brain, and motor nerves, which carry commands from the brain to the muscles. He described the structure of the eye, the anatomy of the reproductive system, and the differences between arteries and veins. His contemporary Erasistratus studied the heart and circulatory system, coming close to understanding the circulation of blood 17 centuries before William Harvey. The works of these physicians were available in the Library of Alexandria. Later physicians quoted them, built on them, argued with them. The medical tradition of Alexandria was famous throughout the ancient world. And then the tradition was broken, the books were lost, and medicine regressed to a state of ignorance that would persist for over 1,000 years. When Renaissance anatomists began dissecting bodies in the 15th and 16th centuries, they thought they were making new discoveries. In many cases, they were rediscovering what Herophilus had already found. These individual scholars represent only a fraction of those who worked at the library over its centuries of operation. For every Euclid or Archimedes whose name we remember, there were dozens of lesser figures who made smaller contributions, and hundreds or thousands of copyists, translators, cataloguers, and administrators who kept the institution functioning. Their collective effort created something unprecedented in human history, and their collective loss set humanity back by centuries. The question of how far back the destruction of the Library of Alexandria set human progress is impossible to answer with precision, but it is important to consider. When we lost the library, we lost not just individual books, but a system for preserving and transmitting knowledge across generations. We lost the accumulated wisdom of centuries that could have been the foundation for further advancement. We lost, in effect, a running start. Consider a specific example. The steam engine, often credited as the invention that launched the Industrial Revolution, was not invented until the 18th century. But we know that Hero of Alexandria, working in the 1st century CE, built a device called the Eolipile, a sphere that spun when steam was expelled from nozzles. Hero wrote about this device, and about numerous other mechanical inventions, in books that were preserved at Alexandria. Hero's Eolipile was a toy, not a practical engine. The technology to build efficient steam engines did not exist in the ancient world. The metallurgy was too primitive, the precision machining too crude. But Hero's writings showed that the basic principle of steam power was understood 2,000 years ago. If that knowledge had been preserved and built upon, if generations of engineers had gradually improved the technology, is it possible that the Industrial Revolution could have happened centuries earlier? The question sounds absurd, but consider how slowly technology advanced after the fall of Alexandria. The 1,000 years between roughly 500 and 1500 CE are sometimes called the Dark Ages in European history, a term that is controversial but not entirely unfounded. During this period, much technological knowledge was lost or stagnant. Buildings were less sophisticated than Roman structures from centuries earlier. Roads deteriorated and were not maintained. Literacy declined dramatically. Scientific inquiry virtually ceased in Western Europe. The Islamic world preserved and extended much of the classical heritage during this period, and Chinese civilization continued advancing independently. But the overall pace of technological progress was far slower than it had been in the Hellenistic period, or than it would become after the Renaissance. We cannot blame all of this stagnation on the loss of the library. The fall of the Roman Empire, the Black Death, the disruption of trade networks, and many other factors contributed to the slowdown. But the loss of centralized knowledge preservation was clearly part of the story. When scholars had to rediscover basic principles rather than building on what others had already found, progress inevitably slowed. Consider another example, the mathematics of calculus, developed independently by Newton and Leibniz in the late 17th century, revolutionized physics and engineering. It enabled the precise calculation of orbits, the design of bridges and buildings, the development of thermodynamics and electromagnetism. But there are hints in ancient sources that Archimedes was approaching similar ideas 2,000 years earlier. His method of exhaustion, used to calculate areas and volumes of curved shapes, is conceptually similar to integration. If his work had been fully preserved and extended by subsequent mathematicians at Alexandria, could calculus have been developed centuries earlier? Could the scientific revolution have happened in the first millennium rather than the second? We cannot know. History does not allow controlled experiments. We cannot rerun the past with different initial conditions and see how things would have turned out. But the possibility that the library's destruction delayed human progress by centuries, or even a millennium, is not as far-fetched as it might seem. The knowledge was there. The potential was there. What was lost was the continuity that would have allowed that knowledge to be transmitted and built upon. This brings us to a difficult question. If the loss was so great, why didn't people try harder to prevent it? Why didn't they make more copies, build more libraries, take more precautions? The answer is that they did try, within the limits of their resources and understanding. But preserving knowledge is expensive and difficult, and the value of that preservation is not always obvious to those who must pay for it. Consider the economics of ancient book production. Copying a single scroll required days or weeks of skilled labour. The materials, papyrus and ink, were not cheap. Storing scrolls required space and careful maintenance. When resources were limited, as they always are, spending on book production and preservation competed with spending on everything else, from military defence to food production to religious observance. It was not obvious to everyone that preserving the writings of long-dead philosophers should take priority over feeding the living poor. Consider also the political instability of the ancient world. Empires rose and fell, cities were sacked and rebuilt, rulers changed, and each new ruler had different priorities. Maintaining a great library required consistent support over centuries, but consistency was exactly what ancient political systems could not provide. Every time a new dynasty came to power, every time a city changed hands, the library's survival was at risk. Finally, consider that the people of Alexandria could not have known how catastrophic their losses would be. They lived in a continuous present, where the books surrounding them seemed permanent and the knowledge they contained seemed secure. They could not have imagined a future in which that knowledge was lost, in which scholars would desperately seek fragments of texts that were commonplace in their time. They could not have predicted the centuries of darkness that would follow, or the painful process of rediscovery that would eventually restore some of what was lost. We are in a similar position today. We assume that the knowledge stored in our libraries, archives, and digital databases is secure. We assume that future generations will have access to everything we know and more. But we cannot be certain. Digital formats become obsolete. Institutions lose funding. Political instability threatens cultural heritage. Climate change creates new risks of fire, flood, and destruction. The lesson of Alexandria is not just about the past. It is a warning for the future. The city of Alexandria itself deserves our attention, because the library did not exist in isolation. It was part of a larger urban environment, a cosmopolitan centre where Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and eventually Roman and Christian cultures mixed and interacted. Understanding the city helps us understand what made the library possible, and why nothing quite like it ever existed again. Alexander the Great founded Alexandria in 331 BCE on a site chosen for its strategic and commercial potential. The city sat on a strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and Lake Mareotis, with access to the Nile through a canal. It had 2 harbours, protected by breakwaters, and an island called Pharos, where the famous lighthouse would eventually stand. The location was perfect for trade, allowing ships from across the Mediterranean to unload their goods and transfer them to boats that could navigate the Nile into the heart of Egypt. From the beginning, Alexandria was designed to be a Greek city transplanted onto Egyptian soil. Its street plan was regular, a grid of broad avenues intersecting at right angles, with open spaces for markets, temples, and public buildings. The main street, called the Canopic Way, ran east to west for over 5 kilometres, lined with colonnades and statues. Visitors described it as the most magnificent street in the world, impressive even to Romans who had seen the grandeur of their own capital. The population of Alexandria at its peak may have reached 500,000 people, making it one of the largest cities in the ancient world. These people were diverse in origin and culture. The ruling class was Macedonian Greek, maintaining their distinct identity and language over centuries. Native Egyptians formed the majority of the labouring population, continuing their traditional crafts and religious practices. A large Jewish community, one of the largest in the ancient world, had its own quarter and its own institutions. Merchants and traders from across the Mediterranean brought additional diversity. This cosmopolitan environment was intellectually stimulating. Ideas from different traditions could encounter each other, sometimes conflicting, sometimes combining to create something new. The translation of Jewish scriptures into Greek, the Septuagint, was a product of this environment. So were various attempts to synthesize Greek philosophy with Egyptian religion. The library was both a cause and a consequence of this intellectual vitality. It attracted scholars who might otherwise have gone elsewhere. It provided resources that made Alexandria a necessary stop for anyone interested in learning. It created a community of intellectuals who could discuss ideas, critique each other's work, and collaborate on projects too large for any individual. The Ptolemaic rulers who built and maintained the library understood its political value. A great library was a statement of power and legitimacy. It said that Alexandria was the centre of civilization, the place where all knowledge converged. It attracted talented people who brought skills and connections that benefited the kingdom. It created obligations among those who used its resources, and it produced prestige that translated into influence throughout the Greek-speaking world. The Ptolemies were competing with other Hellenistic kingdoms for status and power. The Seleucids controlled the eastern remnants of Alexander's empire. The Antigonids ruled Macedonia. Various smaller kingdoms and city-states jockeyed for position. In this competitive environment, cultural achievement was a form of propaganda. The Ptolemies could not claim the strongest army or the most territory, but they could claim the greatest library, the most impressive scholars, the most magnificent cultural institutions. This claim mattered. But political support was always contingent. When the Ptolemaic dynasty weakened, when resources became scarce, when other priorities demanded attention, the library suffered. It was never self-sustaining. It depended on ongoing support from rulers who might or might not choose to provide it. This vulnerability would become critical as political conditions changed over the centuries. The physical layout of the library and Mausion is not entirely clear from ancient sources, but we can reconstruct some features. The Mausion was located in the Bruchium, the royal quarter of the city near the palace complex. It included lecture halls, dining facilities, gardens, and a zoo or botanical garden where exotic animals and plants could be studied. The scholars who worked there lived communally, supported by royal stipends that freed them from economic concerns. The library itself was probably not a single building, but a complex of structures housing different parts of the collection. Scrolls were stored in bins or shelves organized by subject and author. Reading rooms allowed scholars to consult materials without removing them from the premises. Copyists worked in dedicated spaces, producing new scrolls to replace worn ones or to be sold or traded to other libraries. The collection grew through various means. Royal agents purchased books throughout the Mediterranean world. Ships entering the harbour were searched and their books confiscated for copying. Scholars who came to work at the Museion often brought their own books, which were added to the collection. Gifts and bequests from wealthy patrons supplemented these other sources. The result was a collection that grew continuously for nearly 3 centuries, until it contained the largest accumulation of written knowledge the world had ever seen. Managing such a collection required organisation. The position of chief librarian was prestigious and powerful, typically held by a distinguished scholar appointed by the king. The chief librarian oversaw acquisition, cataloguing, conservation and access. He supervised the staff of copyists, translators, and assistants who kept the collection functioning. And he often conducted his own scholarship, producing works that enhanced the library's prestige. The cataloguing system developed at Alexandria was itself a major intellectual achievement. Callimachus, who served as librarian in the 3rd century BCE, created the Pnyx, a comprehensive bibliography of Greek literature organized by genre and author. Each entry included the author's name and biographical information, a list of works, the opening words of each work and the number of lines. This allowed scholars to verify whether they had the complete text of a work and to identify forgeries that might be circulating under famous names. The Pnyx was not a modern library catalogue with call numbers and precise shelf locations, but it was a systematic attempt to organise knowledge in a way that made it accessible. Scholars could consult the Pnyx to learn what existed on any given subject, then request the relevant scrolls from library staff. The concept of organising knowledge systematically, making it findable rather than just accumulated, was revolutionary. It transformed the library from a warehouse of scrolls into a tool for research. The scholarly community at Alexandria developed practices and standards that would influence intellectual work for centuries. They established methods for editing texts, comparing different copies to create the most accurate possible version. They created systems of notation for marking textual variants, corrections, and annotations. They wrote commentaries that explained difficult passages and provided context for understanding ancient works. They developed the practice of scholarly citation, referring to specific works and passages to support arguments. These practices seem obvious to us today because we have inherited them from Alexandria. But they were not obvious at the time. They had to be invented, refined, and transmitted to successive generations. The library was the institution that made this transmission possible. When the library declined and fell, these practices did not disappear entirely, but they became less systematic, less rigorous, less universal. Scholarship suffered as a result. The social life of the Mausion deserves mention as well. The scholars who lived and worked there were not isolated monks devoted only to study. They were members of a community, dining together, discussing ideas, competing for prestige and recognition. Some were difficult personalities, brilliant but arrogant, prone to feuds and rivalries. Some were generous mentors who trained the next generation. Some were bureaucratic functionaries who managed the institution without making original contributions. The community had its politics, its factions, its scandals. Ancient sources preserve accounts of scholars who criticized each other's work savagely, who competed for royal favour, who intrigued for positions and resources. Callimachus and Apollonius of Rhodes famously feuded over literary style, with Callimachus preferring short, polished poems and Apollonius championing the long epic. Their dispute became legendary, representing broader tensions in Hellenistic literature. This human drama makes the library more real, more connected to the kinds of institutions we know today. Universities and research centres in our own time experience similar dynamics, brilliant people doing important work while also engaging in petty conflicts and political manoeuvring. The library was not a temple of pure reason, but a human institution, with all the complexity and contradiction that implies. The library's influence extended beyond Alexandria itself. Other cities established libraries modelled on the Alexandrian example. Pergamum in Asia Minor built a famous library that became a rival to Alexandria. When the Ptolemies supposedly banned the export of papyrus to hamper this competitor, the scholars of Pergamum developed parchment as an alternative writing material. Whether or not this story is true, it illustrates how the idea of the Great Library spread throughout the Hellenistic world. Rome eventually acquired its own significant libraries, including the Palatine Library established by Augustus. The concept of public libraries, institutions where citizens could access books freely, developed over time. By the imperial period, Rome had multiple public libraries with substantial collections. These Roman libraries drew on the Alexandrian model, even as they developed their own distinctive features. The spread of libraries throughout the ancient world provided some redundancy. Texts that existed in multiple copies at multiple locations were more likely to survive any single catastrophe. But Alexandria remained special, the largest collection, the most comprehensive, the place where the rarest and most valuable texts could be found. When Alexandria's collection was destroyed, texts that existed only there were lost forever. The religious transformations that swept through Alexandria in late antiquity played a crucial role in the library's final destruction. Understanding these transformations requires understanding the complex relationship between pagan, Jewish, and Christian communities in the city, and how that relationship changed as Christianity became first legal, then dominant, then mandatory. For the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, Alexandria was a city of many religions. The traditional Egyptian gods were still worshipped in ancient temples. Greek religious practices had been established by the Ptolemies and continued under Roman rule. The Serapeum, the great temple of Serapis, was one of the most impressive religious structures in the city, combining Egyptian and Greek elements in a syncretic cult that had been deliberately created by the early Ptolemies. The large Jewish community maintained its own religious traditions, centered on the synagogue and the study of scripture, and from the 1st century CE onward, Christianity began to spread through Alexandria, eventually becoming one of the most important centers of Christian theology. These communities coexisted, not always peacefully, but without any single religion having the power to suppress the others. Occasional conflicts erupted, particularly between Jews and Greeks, but the Roman authorities generally maintained order and protected the rights of all communities to practice their religions. The library and Mousillon, as secular institutions serving scholars of all backgrounds, were not directly threatened by this religious diversity. The situation began to change in the 4th century, when Christianity went from being a persecuted minority to being the favoured religion of the Roman Empire. Constantine's Edict of Milan in 313 CE legalised Christianity. Subsequent emperors increasingly favoured the Church, providing resources, privileges, and eventually legal enforcement of Christian orthodoxy. By the end of the 4th century, paganism was being actively suppressed, its temples closed, its rituals banned. In Alexandria, this transformation played out with particular intensity. The city had been a centre of Christian intellectual life since the 2nd century, home to the famous catechetical school, where teachers like Clement and Origen had developed sophisticated theological systems. But Alexandria also remained a stronghold of paganism, with the Serapeum serving as both a religious centre and an institution of learning. The daughter library housed there represented a significant portion of the classical heritage. The conflict came to a head in 391 CE, when the Christian patriarch Theophilus led a campaign to destroy the Serapeum. The immediate trigger was a conflict over a pagan temple that Christians had converted into a church. Pagans protested, violence erupted, and the situation escalated. Theophilus seized the opportunity to demand the destruction of the Serapeum itself, the greatest pagan temple in the city. The Emperor Theodosius authorized the demolition. What happened next is described by multiple ancient sources, though they disagree on details. A Christian mob attacked the Serapeum, overwhelming its defenders. The great statue of Serapis, one of the wonders of the ancient world, was destroyed. The temple buildings were demolished or converted to Christian use, and the library housed within the complex was either destroyed outright or dispersed and eventually lost. The Christian sources that describe these events generally present them as a triumph over paganism, the destruction of idols and the victory of truth. They do not express regret over any loss of books or learning. This silence is itself significant. It suggests either that the library had already been depleted and there was little left to lose, or that the Christian authorities did not consider the preservation of pagan learning to be a priority. Some modern historians argue that the library at the Serapeum was never particularly significant, that it was a secondary collection that had been established long after the main library had already declined. Others argue that by 391 CE, the Serapeum library was the last significant repository of classical texts in Alexandria, and its destruction was the final blow to the intellectual heritage of the ancient city. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The destruction of the Serapeum was certainly a blow to classical learning, but it was one of many blows spread over centuries. The event that has attracted the most attention from modern observers may not have been the most devastating to the collection. One figure associated with this period deserves special attention, not because she was connected to the library directly, but because her fate symbolizes the broader transformation of Alexandria from a centre of learning to a battleground of religious conflict. Hypatia was a philosopher and mathematician who taught in Alexandria in the late 4th and early 5th centuries. She was the daughter of Theon, a mathematician who had edited and commented on classical texts, and she followed her father into scholarly work. She taught Neoplatonic philosophy and mathematics to students who came from across the Mediterranean. She was respected by pagans and Christians alike for her learning and her personal virtue. In 415 CE, Hypatia was murdered by a Christian mob, dragged from her carriage, stripped, and killed with tiles or pottery shards. Her body was then dismembered and burned. The reasons for this murder are complex and disputed. She was not killed simply for being a pagan philosopher. She had Christian students and patrons who respected her greatly. But she was caught up in a political conflict between the Patriarch Cyril and the Roman prefect Orestes. Her close relationship with Orestes made her a target for those who supported Cyril. Her death was as much political as religious. The murder of Hypatia did not end philosophy in Alexandria. The Neoplatonic school continued for another century. But her death symbolized the increasing danger that intellectual activity faced in an environment of religious and political conflict. Scholars who wanted to pursue their work in safety had to navigate carefully, avoiding associations that might make them targets. The free inquiry that had characterized Alexandrian scholarship in its golden age was no longer possible. The final centuries of antiquity saw the gradual dissolution of classical learning in Alexandria. The Neoplatonic school closed around 517 CE, when its last leader, a philosopher named Olympiodorus, died without a successor. Christian theological schools continued, but their focus was on religious rather than secular knowledge. The manuscript collections that had survived the various catastrophes were scattered, some going to Constantinople, some to monasteries in Egypt and elsewhere, some simply decaying from neglect. By the time of the Arab conquest in 641 CE, Alexandria was no longer the intellectual capital it had been 1,000 years earlier. It was still a major city, still important for trade, still home to significant religious institutions. But the library was gone, the mousillon was gone, the community of scholars was gone. Whatever books remained were scattered remnants, preserved almost accidentally, their significance sometimes not even recognized by those who possessed them. The story of the library's destruction is thus not a simple story of villains and victims. It is a story of gradual decline, of changing values, of resources directed elsewhere, of catastrophes that each took a portion of what remained. The religious conflicts of late antiquity played a role, but so did the earlier fires, the earlier periods of neglect, the earlier failures to maintain what had been built. The library died of many causes, and blaming any single group or event misses the complexity of what actually happened. The question of what specifically was lost at Alexandria haunts historians and scientists to this day. We know the names of hundreds of works that no longer exist. We have fragments and summaries that tantalize us with hints of what the complete text contained. We have references in surviving works to sources that we can no longer consult. From these scattered clues, we can reconstruct partial images of what the ancient world knew and we have forgotten. The field of astronomy offers particularly poignant examples. We know that ancient astronomers made observations over centuries, tracking the positions of stars and planets with careful precision. These observations would be invaluable for understanding long-term celestial phenomena, from the precession of the equinoxes to the orbital dynamics of the planets. But most of these observations are lost. When Tycho Brahe began his systematic observations in the 16th century, he was essentially starting over, without access to the millennia of data that had been accumulated at Alexandria and elsewhere. The astronomer Hipparchus, who worked at Alexandria in the 2nd century BCE, created star catalogues that listed the positions and brightnesses of hundreds of stars. He compared his observations with earlier records and detected the precession of the equinoxes, the slow shift in the position of the celestial pole over thousands of years. His catalogues were the basis for later work by Ptolemy and others, but the original Hipparchian catalogues are lost. We have only what Ptolemy chose to preserve and extend in his own work. What observations did Hipparchus make that Ptolemy did not include? What phenomena did he notice that we have not rediscovered? The astronomer Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system 18 centuries before Copernicus. We know this from references in other authors, particularly Archimedes. but Aristarchus's own treatise explaining his model is lost. We do not know what evidence he presented, what arguments he made, what objections he anticipated. If his work had survived, might the scientific revolution have happened centuries earlier? Might we have understood the true nature of the cosmos sooner, developed better astronomical instruments sooner, begun the exploration of space sooner? In mathematics, we have the first 4 books of Apollonius's work on conic sections in Greek, and the next 3 only in Arabic translation. The 8th book is completely lost. Archimedes wrote numerous works on mathematics and physics. Some survive, some are lost, and some were only rediscovered in the 20th century hidden in palimpsests. How many other Archimedean texts remain to be found, and how many have been destroyed forever? In medicine, the losses are perhaps most tragic because they affected human health directly. The physicians of Alexandria made discoveries about anatomy and physiology that would not be repeated for over 1,000 years. When their works were lost, medicine regressed. Treatments that the Alexandrians knew were effective were forgotten. Knowledge of human anatomy that could have guided surgical procedures was lost. People died of conditions that ancient physicians had understood how to treat. The philosopher Chrysippus wrote over 700 works developing Stoic philosophy. None of them survive complete. We have only fragments preserved in quotations by other authors, enough to know that his work was influential, but not enough to fully understand his arguments. The same is true for most of the early Stoics, whose ideas we know mainly through later summaries and reconstructions. The historian Manetho wrote a comprehensive history of Egypt from the earliest times to his own day, the 3rd century BCE. This work was a crucial source for later historians, and remains important for establishing the chronology of ancient Egypt, but we have only excerpts and summaries preserved by other authors. The original work is lost. What details did Manetho include that his excerptors left out? What events did he describe that we now know nothing about? The geographer and historian Agathocles wrote extensive accounts of the regions around the Red Sea, including detailed descriptions of the peoples, animals, and landscapes he observed or learned about. These descriptions would be invaluable for understanding the ancient world's knowledge of Africa and Arabia. But the original works are lost. We have only summaries and excerpts preserved by later authors like Diodorus Siculus and Strabo. The literary losses are equally significant, though perhaps less immediately practical. We have references to hundreds of Greek playwrights whose works are completely lost. Of the thousands of plays written during the great age of Athenian drama, we have complete texts of only 44, all by just 4 authors. The rest exist only as titles, fragments, and summaries. What stories did they tell? What insights did they offer into the human condition? We cannot know. The works of the 9 lyric poets, canonized by Alexandrian scholars as the greatest poets of archaic Greece, survive mostly in fragments. We have substantial remains of Pindar, whose victriodes were preserved because they continued to be studied in schools. But of Sappho, celebrated in antiquity as one of the greatest poets who ever lived, we have only 1 complete poem and numerous fragments, some recovered from papyri found in Egyptian garbage dumps. Her ancient reputation rested on 9 books of poetry. We have perhaps 5% of what she wrote. These losses extend beyond individual works to entire categories of literature. Ancient literary criticism discussed genres and forms that we can barely reconstruct because the examples are lost. Ancient philosophy addressed questions and arguments that we cannot fully understand because the texts that contained them no longer exist. Ancient science made discoveries and developed theories that we have had to rediscover independently, without the benefit of building on what came before. The fragments that survive often tantalize us with hints of what we are missing. A single sentence quoted by a later author suggests that an ancient scientist had anticipated a modern discovery. A title listed in an ancient bibliography indicates that someone wrote about a subject we thought was not addressed until centuries later. These hints remind us that the ancient world was more sophisticated than we sometimes assume, and that our progress has been slowed by the loss of knowledge that once existed. The story of the Library of Alexandria does not end with its destruction. What followed was a long process of preservation, transmission, and eventual recovery that involved multiple civilizations and spanned more than 1,000 years. Understanding this process helps us appreciate both what was lost and what was saved, and how the fragments of ancient knowledge eventually found their way into the modern world. When Alexandria declined as a center of learning, other cities took up the role of preserving classical knowledge. Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, became the most important of these successor centres. Founded by Constantine in 330 CE, Constantinople inherited the administrative and cultural traditions of the Roman Empire. Its scholars, writing in Greek, had direct access to the classical heritage without the need for translation. The libraries of Constantinople preserved texts that had been lost elsewhere. Throughout the medieval period, Byzantine scholars copied and studied ancient manuscripts, maintaining a continuous tradition of Greek learning that had no equivalent in Western Europe. They wrote commentaries on Aristotle and Plato. They studied Euclid and Archimedes. They preserved works of literature, history, and science that would otherwise have been lost. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, many Greek scholars fled to Italy, bringing their manuscripts with them and sparking the revival of Greek learning in the West. But Constantinople's role in preservation should not be overstated. Byzantine scholars were selective in what they copied and preserved. Christian texts received more attention than pagan ones. Works that were useful for education or aligned with Byzantine values were more likely to survive. Texts that seemed irrelevant, dangerous, or simply boring were allowed to decay. Each act of selection was also an act of destruction, as works that were not copied eventually crumbled to dust. The other great centre of preservation was the Islamic world. Beginning in the 8th century, Muslim scholars undertook a massive project of translation, rendering Greek works into Arabic. This project was centred in Baghdad, where the Abbasid caliphs established the House of Wisdom, an institution consciously modelled on the Library of Alexandria. The translation movement was driven by practical and intellectual motives. Muslim scholars recognised that the Greeks had made important discoveries in medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and other fields. They wanted access to this knowledge for its own sake, and for the practical benefits it could provide. The Caliph al-Ma'mun, who reigned from 813 to 833, was particularly enthusiastic, reportedly paying translators the weight of their completed manuscripts in gold. The translators faced enormous challenges. Greek and Arabic are very different languages, with different conceptual frameworks and different ways of expressing ideas. Technical terms had to be invented or adapted. Concepts that were clear in Greek could become obscure in Arabic and vice versa. The translators developed sophisticated techniques to deal with these challenges, sometimes providing multiple translations of the same passage to capture different shades of meaning. The works that were translated into Arabic included most of the major Greek scientific and philosophical texts: Euclid's Elements, Ptolemy's Almagest, Aristotle's logical and natural philosophical works, Plato's dialogues, the medical writings attributed to Hippocrates and Galen, the astronomical works of Hipparchus, the mathematical works of Archimedes and Apollonius. For several centuries, the most complete versions of many Greek texts existed not in Greek, but in Arabic. Islamic scholars did not just preserve and translate Greek knowledge, they extended it, making original contributions that built on the classical foundations. In mathematics, Al-Khwarizmi developed algebra, whose name comes from the Arabic word al-Jaba in the title of his treatise. In optics, Ibn al-Haytham conducted experiments on light and vision that anticipated modern scientific methods. In medicine, Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote encyclopedic works that systematized and extended Greek medical knowledge. In astronomy, Islamic scholars made observations and calculations that improved on Ptolemy's models. These contributions were possible because Islamic scholars had access to the accumulated Greek knowledge through the translation movement. They could start from where the Greeks had left off rather than beginning from scratch. The House of Wisdom and similar institutions provided the resources and community that serious scholarship required. In this sense, the Islamic world inherited the role that Alexandria had once played. The transmission of Greek knowledge from the Islamic world to Western Europe began in the 11th and 12th centuries, primarily through Spain and Sicily, where Christian and Muslim territories came into contact. Scholars like Gerard of Cremona travelled to Toledo, which had recently been conquered by Christian forces, and undertook the arduous work of translating Arabic texts into Latin. These translations brought Aristotle, Euclid, Ptolemy, and other Greek authors to Western readers who had been largely cut off from classical learning for centuries. The impact was revolutionary. European scholars suddenly had access to systematic treatments of logic, natural philosophy, mathematics, and astronomy that far exceeded anything available in the existing Latin tradition. Universities were founded to study this newly recovered knowledge. Scholastic philosophers like Thomas Aquinas worked to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. The foundations were being laid for the intellectual revival that would eventually produce the Renaissance and the scientific revolution. But the transmission process involved losses as well as gains. Works that had not been translated into Arabic could not be transmitted to the West through this route. Works that were in Arabic but did not seem interesting or useful to medieval translators were not rendered into Latin. Each link in the chain of transmission was an opportunity for loss. The texts that eventually reached Western Europe were a selection of a selection of a selection, filtered through multiple processes of copying, translating, and choosing what to preserve. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 added another wave of transmission. Greek scholars fleeing the Ottoman conquest brought manuscripts directly from Byzantine libraries to Italy. These included works that had never been translated into Arabic or Latin, offering Western scholars direct access to the Greek originals for the first time in centuries. The study of Greek became fashionable among Italian humanists, who prided themselves on reading ancient authors in their original language, rather than through the distortions of translation. The combination of Arabic to Latin translations and direct Greek manuscripts created the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance. Scholars could now compare different versions of ancient texts, identifying errors that had crept in through centuries of copying and translation. They could read works that had been unknown in the medieval West, discovering aspects of ancient thought that had been lost. They could aspire to match and eventually surpass the achievements of the ancients, now that they understood what those achievements actually were. The printing press, invented around 1440, transformed this situation further. Before printing, every copy of a book had to be made by hand, a laborious process that limited how widely text could circulate. Printing allowed text to be reproduced quickly and cheaply, ensuring that knowledge preserved in a few manuscripts could be disseminated across Europe. Works that might have been lost if their few remaining copies had been destroyed were now safe, existing in hundreds or thousands of printed copies. The first printed editions of Greek and Latin classics appeared in the late 15th century. By the 16th century, most of the surviving ancient texts were available in print, accessible to anyone with the resources to buy books and the education to read them. The narrow stream of transmission, which had depended on individual manuscripts carefully copied and preserved over centuries, became a broad river of printed texts flowing across the continent. This was the beginning of the modern era of scholarship, in which ancient texts are studied, edited, translated, and interpreted by communities of researchers working across national and linguistic boundaries. The texts that survived the fall of Alexandria, the transformations of late antiquity, the translation movements of the medieval period, and the disruptions of the Renaissance are now as secure as human knowledge can be. They exist in countless copies, in multiple languages, in formats ranging from scholarly critical editions to paperback translations to digital texts, freely available on the internet. But the losses remain. The works that did not survive the various catastrophes and filters cannot be recovered. We can know that they existed, sometimes even know their titles and approximate contents, but we cannot read them. They are gone forever, casualties of a process that preserved some of the ancient heritage while allowing most of it to be destroyed. The philosophical implications of the Library of Alexandria's destruction extend beyond the specific knowledge that was lost. The library represented an ideal, a vision of what human civilization could achieve through the systematic collection and preservation of knowledge. Its destruction challenges us to consider the nature of progress, the fragility of civilization, and our responsibilities to future generations. The ancient world, at its best, believed in the accumulation of knowledge across generations. Each generation could start from where the previous one had left off, building on foundations that had been carefully laid and preserved. The library was the physical embodiment of this belief, the institution that made intergenerational progress possible. When the library was destroyed, this chain of transmission was broken. Knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries was lost. Discoveries that could have been built upon were forgotten. The next generation could not start from where the previous one had left off, because they no longer knew where the previous generation had been. This is what makes the library's destruction so tragic and so relevant to our own time. It demonstrates that progress is not inevitable, that civilization can go backward as well as forward, that knowledge can be lost as well as gained. We sometimes assume that once something is known, it will always be known, that the arrow of history points only in one direction. The library's destruction proves this assumption wrong. The centuries that followed the library's decline are sometimes called the Dark Ages, a term that's controversial but not entirely inaccurate. During this period, at least in Western Europe, literacy declined, cities shrank, long-distance trade diminished, and technological innovation slowed or reversed. The sophisticated achievements of the Roman Empire were followed by a period of reduced complexity and capability. This was not inevitable. It was not the natural order of things. It was the result of specific historical circumstances, including the loss of the knowledge and institutions that had made Roman achievements possible. The library's destruction was part of this broader collapse. The institutions that preserved and transmitted knowledge were damaged or destroyed. The communities of scholars who understood and extended that knowledge were dispersed or killed. The physical texts that embodied centuries of learning were burned or left to decay. When medieval Europeans finally began to recover classical knowledge, they had to do so through a laborious process of translation, interpretation, and reconstruction that would have been unnecessary if the original institutions had survived. The lesson for our own time is clear. We cannot assume that our knowledge is secure. We cannot assume that our institutions will endure. We cannot assume that future generations will have access to everything we know. We must actively preserve, protect, and transmit our knowledge, or we risk losing it just as the ancients lost theirs. Consider the challenges facing knowledge preservation today. Digital formats become obsolete within decades. Software required to read old files is no longer supported. Hardware that can run old software becomes unavailable. Data stored on magnetic tapes, floppy disks, and even early hard drives is already inaccessible to most users. The digital revolution, which promised to make all knowledge universally available, is creating its own forms of obsolescence and loss. Libraries and archives face chronic underfunding. Governments and institutions that should support preservation often see it as a low priority, something that can be cut when budgets are tight. The people who work in preservation are often undervalued and underpaid, despite the crucial importance of their work. Collections that have survived for centuries are at risk because the resources to maintain them are not provided. Climate change threatens physical collections with flooding, fire, and extreme weather. Coastal institutions face rising sea levels and intensifying storms. Inland institutions face increased risk of wildfire. Temperature and humidity fluctuations damage paper and parchment. The physical infrastructure of knowledge preservation is being stressed by environmental changes that will only intensify in the coming decades. Political instability destroys cultural heritage directly. The destruction of Iraqi museums and libraries during the 2003 invasion. The damage to Syrian archaeological sites during the civil war. The Taliban's destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas. The looting of Libyan archaeological sites during the chaos following Gaddafi's fall. These events remind us that cultural heritage is always vulnerable to violence and that the will to preserve must contend with the will to destroy. Even without dramatic catastrophes, knowledge can be lost through neglect. Texts that are not read are not copied. Languages that are not taught cannot be understood. Traditions that are not maintained are forgotten. The slow erosion of attention can be as destructive as fire or war, just operating over longer timescales. The Library of Alexandria was not destroyed by a single dramatic event. It died gradually, through a combination of catastrophes and neglect over several centuries. Our own knowledge could die the same way, not through a sudden disaster, but through the cumulative effect of many small failures to preserve, maintain, and transmit what we know. What can we do to prevent this? The first step is to recognize the problem, to understand that knowledge preservation is not automatic and requires active effort. We must value the work of librarians, archivists, conservators, and others who maintain our intellectual heritage. We must provide resources for their work, not as an afterthought but as a priority. We must develop technologies and practices that ensure long-term accessibility, not just immediate convenience. We must create redundancy, ensuring that important knowledge exists in multiple formats in multiple locations. We must build institutions that can survive political and economic disruption, that are not dependent on any single source of funding or support. We must cultivate communities of knowledge that can maintain and transmit understanding even when formal institutions fail. And we must remember, We must tell the story of Alexandria and other great losses, keeping alive the awareness that knowledge is fragile and precious. We must honour those who work to preserve what we know. We must teach each generation the importance of maintaining the chain of transmission that connects us to the past and to the future. The Library of Alexandria cannot be rebuilt. The texts that were lost cannot be recovered. The scholars who died cannot be brought back, but we can learn from the tragedy. We can resolve to do better. We can commit to preserving our own knowledge for future generations, ensuring that they do not suffer the same losses that we have suffered. This is the lesson of Alexandria. This is the responsibility that falls on each of us. The city of Alexandria still exists today. It is Egypt's second largest city, a major port, a centre of commerce and culture. The ancient library is long gone, but the memory of what it represented has inspired modern efforts to recapture something of its spirit. The most notable of these efforts is the Bibliotheca Alexandrina, a new library opened in 2002 on a site near where the ancient library is believed to have stood. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina is a remarkable institution. Its building, designed by a Norwegian architectural firm, features a tilted circular roof that evokes a sun rising over the Mediterranean. The main reading room can accommodate 2,000 readers and holds millions of books. The complex includes museums, galleries, a planetarium, and specialised archives for manuscripts, rare books, and digital materials. The library hosts conferences, exhibitions, and cultural events. It serves as a centre for scholarship and education, attracting researchers and students from across Egypt and beyond. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina cannot replace what was lost. The ancient texts that were destroyed cannot be magically recreated. The centuries of lost progress cannot be recovered. The new library is a symbol and an aspiration, not a resurrection. But it represents an important commitment, a recognition that the ideals of the ancient library are worth honouring and continuing. The new library faces challenges that the ancient library never encountered. The digital revolution has transformed how information is created, stored, and accessed. Books are no longer the primary medium for scholarly communication. Journals, databases, and online resources play roles that would have been unimaginable to ancient librarians. The Bibliotheca Alexandrina must navigate this new landscape, while also preserving the traditional functions of a research library. The political and economic context is also challenging. Egypt has experienced significant instability in recent years, including the revolution of 2011 and its aftermath. The library has had to operate through periods of uncertainty, maintaining its programs and protecting its collections while the country around it changed. This experience connects it to the ancient library, which also had to survive political transitions and periods of conflict. Other institutions around the world carry on the Alexandrian tradition in different ways. The great national libraries, the Library of Congress in Washington, the British Library in London, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France in Paris, collect and preserve materials on a scale that the ancient librarians could never have imagined. University libraries support research and teaching. Public libraries provide access to knowledge for ordinary citizens. Digital archives preserve materials that exist only in electronic form. The ideal of universal access to knowledge that the ancient library represented has been democratized and distributed across thousands of institutions worldwide. Yet the spirit of Alexandria, the ambition to gather all human knowledge in one place, to create an institution that preserves and extends understanding across generations, remains compelling. We still dream of comprehensive collections, of universal access, of scholarship that builds on everything that came before. We still struggle against the forces of destruction and neglect that threaten to fragment and destroy our intellectual heritage. We are all heirs of Alexandria, whether we know it or not. The night has grown long, and we have travelled together through more than 2,000 years of history. We have seen the library rise and fall. We have met the scholars who worked there and glimpsed the knowledge they created. We have traced the slow process of destruction and the long process of partial recovery. We have considered what was lost and what remains. The Library of Alexandria was the greatest collection of knowledge the ancient world ever produced. It gathered the wisdom of Egypt, Greece, Persia, Babylon, Judea, and a dozen other civilizations into a single institution. It supported scholars who made discoveries that would not be equalled for more than 1,000 years. It represented an ideal of learning that still inspires us today, and it was destroyed. Gradually, over centuries through fire and war and neglect and the changing priorities of those who controlled its fate. The knowledge it contained was scattered and lost. The scholars who worked there were dispersed and killed. The institution itself disappeared, leaving only fragments and memories and the enduring question of what might have been. We cannot know what the world would look like if the library had survived. We cannot calculate how many years of progress were lost, how many discoveries were delayed, how many lives could have been saved by knowledge that was destroyed. We can only recognize that the loss was real and profound, that we are still living with its consequences, and that we face the same challenges of preservation that the ancients faced. The texts that survived did so through chains of transmission that often seem miraculous. A single manuscript, copied by a monk who may not have understood what he was copying, preserved in a monastery that happened to escape the various catastrophes of medieval history, eventually printed and distributed across the world. So much depended on chance, on individual decisions, on circumstances that could easily have been different. The next time you read Euclid or Archimedes, Plato or Aristotle, remember that you are holding something precious, something that almost didn't survive, something that represents centuries of effort by people who believed that knowledge was worth preserving. The next time you visit a library or archive, remember that you're in a place that continues a tradition stretching back to Alexandria, that the librarians and archivists who work there are doing the same essential work that their ancient predecessors did. The next time you learn something new, remember that you are part of the great chain of transmission that connects us to the past and to the future. That knowledge exists only because people make the effort to learn it and teach it and preserve it. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but the dream that it represented lives on. The dream of gathering all human knowledge, the dream of preserving that knowledge for future generations, the dream of building on what came before to reach heights that would otherwise be impossible. That dream belongs to all of us now. It is our responsibility to carry it forward. The ancient librarians who worked at Alexandria could not have imagined the world we live in today. They could not have conceived of computers or the internet, of spacecraft or antibiotics, of the vast accumulation of knowledge that has occurred since their time. But they would recognize what we are trying to do. They would understand our commitment to learning, our desire to preserve, our hope that future generations will know more than we know. They are our intellectual ancestors. We owe them a debt that we can only repay by doing for the future what they tried to do for us. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, let the story of Alexandria settle into your dreams. Think of the scholars who walked its halls, reading texts that we will never see. Think of the knowledge that was created there, some of which has reached us and much of which has been lost forever. Think of the slow destruction that consumed one of humanity's greatest achievements, and think of our responsibility to prevent such destruction from happening again. The library burned, but libraries still exist. The knowledge was lost, but knowledge continues to grow. The dream was shattered, but dreams can be renewed. This is the message of Alexandria. This is the hope that survives the tragedy. This is what we carry forward into the future, the commitment to preserve and extend and transmit what we know, so that our descendants will not have to start over as our ancestors did. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's greatest tragedies and one of its most enduring legacies. If you enjoyed this exploration, please subscribe so you don't miss the next voyage into forgotten history. If you have thoughts about the library or about knowledge preservation, leave a comment. And if you found yourself drifting towards sleep during this long journey, through ancient wisdom and modern responsibility, that is exactly what these stories are for. Rest well tonight. Dream of scrolls and scholars, of fire and survival, of all the knowledge that was lost and all the knowledge that endures. The library is gone, but its spirit lives on in everyone who loves learning and commits to preserving what we know. Good night. The specific discoveries made at Alexandria deserve deeper exploration, because they reveal just how advanced ancient knowledge was before it was lost. These were not primitive guesses or lucky accidents. They were rigorous investigations conducted by brilliant minds, using methods that we would recognize as scientific. Understanding these discoveries helps us appreciate the magnitude of what the library's destruction cost humanity. Eratosthenes' calculation of the Earth's circumference stands as one of the most elegant scientific achievements of the ancient world. Working around 240 BCE, with no telescopes, no satellites, no instruments beyond the simplest tools, he determined the size of our planet with remarkable accuracy. His method was beautiful in its simplicity. Eratosthenes knew that in the Egyptian city of Syene, modern Aswan, the sun was directly overhead at noon on the summer solstice. He knew this because on that day the sun's reflection could be seen at the bottom of deep wells, which would only happen if the sun was at the zenith. In Alexandria, on the same day at the same time, the sun was not directly overhead. By measuring the angle of the shadow cast by a vertical stick, Eratosthenes determined that the sun was about 7 degrees from vertical. He reasoned that this difference was caused by the curvature of the Earth. If the Earth were flat, the sun would appear at the same angle from both locations. The fact that it appeared at different angles meant that Alexandria and Syene were on different parts of a curved surface. From the angle difference and the known distance between the two cities, Eratosthenes could calculate the full circumference of the Earth. His result, about 250,000 stadia, translates to approximately 40,000 kilometers, depending on which length we use for the stadia measurement. The modern value is about 40,075 kilometers. Eratosthenes was off by at most a few percent, and possibly was almost exactly right. This calculation was not a one-time curiosity. It had practical implications for navigation, cartography, and understanding the world. It demonstrated that careful observation and mathematical reasoning could reveal truths about nature that were not directly visible. It showed that the Earth was a sphere of known size floating in space, subject to geometric laws that humans could discover and use. The knowledge of the Earth's size and shape was available in the Library of Alexandria. Anyone who wanted to could consult Eratosthenes' treatise and learn how the calculation was done. This knowledge informed later Greek and Roman geography. It was transmitted to the Islamic world through the translation movement. It influenced medieval scholars who debated the shape and size of the Earth. But the original treatise was lost. We know about Eratosthenes' calculation primarily through descriptions by later authors, not through his own words. The details of his methods, the data he used, the alternative approaches he considered, all of this is gone. Aristarchus of Samos proposed the heliocentric theory around 280 BCE, arguing that the Earth and other planets revolved around the Sun rather than everything revolving around the Earth. This was 18 centuries before Copernicus, and it was not just a lucky guess. Aristarchus had reasons for his theory, even if we don't know exactly what they were. We know that Aristarchus wrote a treatise explaining his heliocentric model. Archimedes mentions it in his work The Sand Reckoner, where he discusses the implications of Aristarchus's cosmology for calculating the number of grains of sand that would fill the universe. Other ancient authors reference the theory as well, sometimes to argue against it. But the original treatise is lost. We do not know what evidence Aristarchus presented. We do not know how he addressed the obvious objection that if the Earth moves, we should be able to detect that motion. We do not know whether he anticipated any of the arguments that would eventually convince people that Copernicus was right. For 1800 years after Aristarchus, astronomers believed that the Earth stood still at the centre of the cosmos. They developed increasingly complex models to explain the observed motions of the planets, adding circles upon circles to make the geocentric theory fit the data. When Copernicus finally revived the heliocentric idea, he did so based on his own reasoning, apparently unaware that he was following a path that Aristarchus had blazed long before. How might the history of astronomy have been different if Aristarchus's treatise had survived? If astronomers had continued to develop and refine the heliocentric model through the intervening centuries? If the conceptual framework for understanding the solar system had been available to medieval scholars? These questions cannot be answered, but they suggest the scope of what was lost. The medical discoveries made at Alexandria were perhaps even more consequential because they directly affected human health and survival. The physicians Herophilus and Erasistratus, working in the 3rd century BCE, conducted systematic dissections of human bodies that would not be repeated in the Western world for over 1,000 years. Herophilus is sometimes called the father of anatomy. He distinguished between the cerebrum and cerebellum in the brain. He identified the nervous system and distinguished between sensory and motor nerves. He described the anatomy of the eye in detail. He studied the reproductive system in both males and females. He identified the pulse as originating from the heart and used it as a diagnostic tool. He wrote at least 9 major works on anatomy and medicine. We have only fragments quoted by later authors. The detailed descriptions and careful observations that characterized his work are lost. When anatomists in the 16th century began dissecting human bodies again, They had to rediscover much of what Herophilus had already found. Erasistratus studied the circulatory system, coming close to understanding the circulation of blood. He recognized that arteries and veins formed a connected system. He studied the valves of the heart. He may have understood that blood flowed from arteries to veins through tiny vessels that he could not directly observe. Some scholars believe he was close to the discovery that William Harvey would make 18 centuries later. The loss of this medical knowledge had direct human costs. Treatments that the Alexandrian physicians knew were effective were forgotten. Anatomical knowledge that could have guided surgical procedures was lost. Understanding of disease processes that had been painstakingly developed was erased. When medieval and early modern physicians tried to treat patients, they often relied on theories that had been superseded in Alexandria centuries before. How many people died because this knowledge was lost? The question is unanswerable but important. Medical knowledge directly affects survival. When effective treatments are forgotten, people die who would otherwise have lived. The destruction of Alexandrian medical texts was not just an abstract intellectual loss. It was a catastrophe measured in human lives. The mathematical achievements preserved and extended at Alexandria formed the foundation for all subsequent Western mathematics. Euclid's Elements, compiled around 300 BCE, systematized centuries of Greek geometric knowledge into a logical framework that would dominate mathematical education for over 2,000 years. The work demonstrated how to build complex knowledge from simple foundations through rigorous proof. Euclid did not discover all the theorems in the Elements. Many were known to earlier mathematicians. His achievement was organizational and methodological, showing how mathematical knowledge could be structured and verified. This approach became the model for all rigorous thinking, influencing not just mathematics but philosophy, science, and even theology. When early modern scientists like Newton and Galileo sought to establish their theories on firm foundations, they looked to Euclidean geometry as their model. Archimedes extended Greek mathematics in directions that anticipated calculus. His method of exhaustion, used to calculate areas and volumes of curved shapes, involves ideas that are conceptually similar to integration. He calculated the area of a parabolic segment, the surface area and volume of a sphere, and other results that required dealing with infinitely small quantities in controlled ways. Some of his work survived, copied and transmitted through the chains of preservation we have discussed. Others were lost and only partially recovered. In 1906, a Danish scholar named Johann Heiberg discovered a palimpsest, a parchment that had been scraped clean and reused for religious texts. Beneath the prayers, he found previously unknown works of Archimedes, including a treatise called The Method that explained how Archimedes had actually discovered his results before proving them rigorously. This discovery transformed our understanding of ancient mathematics. It showed that Archimedes used physical reasoning and intuition to find results that he then proved by rigorous methods. The method had been lost for over 1,000 years, and with it, insight into how one of history's greatest mathematicians actually thought. How many other such insights remain lost forever? Apollonius of Perga, who worked at Alexandria in the late 3rd century BCE, wrote the definitive ancient work on conic sections, the curves formed when a plane intersects a cone. These curves, the circle, ellipse, parabola, and hyperbola, turn out to be fundamental to understanding nature. Planetary orbits are ellipses. Projectiles follow parabolic paths. Hyperbolas describe certain physical relationships. Apollonius's work was essential background for later developments in physics and astronomy. Of his 8 books on conic sections, we have the first 4 in Greek and the next 3 only in Arabic translation. The 8th book is completely lost. We have tantalizing references to its contents, suggestions that it addressed problems of finding specific points on conic sections with particular properties. What exactly was in that book? What techniques did Apollonius develop? What problems did he solve? We will never know. These mathematical works were available at the Library of Alexandria. Scholars could consult them, study them, extend them. The tradition of Greek mathematics could have continued developing, building on these foundations toward ever more sophisticated achievements. Instead, the tradition was broken. The works were scattered. Many were lost entirely. Those that survived had to be rediscovered and relearned by later generations, who did not have access to the full context of ancient mathematical thought. The astronomical observations made at Alexandria represent another category of irreplaceable loss. Astronomy depends on observations made over long time periods. Phenomena that change slowly, like the precession of the equinoxes or the subtle variations in planetary orbits, can only be detected by comparing observations made decades or centuries apart. The longer the baseline of observations, the more precisely these phenomena can be measured. The astronomers at Alexandria made systematic observations over several centuries, recording the positions of stars and planets with the best instruments available at the time. Hipparchus, working in the 2nd century BCE, compiled star catalogues and made observations that he compared with records made by earlier astronomers. This allowed him to detect the precession of the equinoxes, the slow wobble in Earth's axis that causes the celestial pole to trace a circle in the sky over about 26,000 years. Hipparchus's observations were the foundation for later astronomical work. Ptolemy, writing in the 2nd century CE, used Hipparchus's data along with his own observations to construct the geocentric model of the cosmos that dominated Western and Islamic astronomy for over 1,000 years. The Almagest, Ptolemy's great astronomical treatise, preserves some of what Hipparchus discovered, but it is a selection, a summary, not the original data. The original observations, the raw data that Hipparchus collected, are mostly lost. When Tycho Brahe began his systematic observations in the late 16th century, he was essentially starting over. He could not build on the Alexandrian observations because they were no longer available. The astronomical tradition had been broken, and centuries of potential data had been lost. Consider what we might have learned if those observations had survived. The subtle variations in planetary orbits that revealed the gravitational influences of multiple bodies, the proper motions of stars that proved they were not fixed on a celestial sphere but moving through space, the changes in the brightness of variable stars that revealed new classes of celestial objects. All of these discoveries had to be made from scratch in the early modern period because the ancient observations that might have revealed them were gone. The geographical knowledge accumulated at Alexandria was similarly lost. Ancient geographers compiled descriptions of the known world, from Britain to India, from the Arctic to Ethiopia. They recorded the locations of cities, the courses of rivers, the shapes of coastlines. They described the peoples who lived in different regions, their customs and languages and forms of government. Eratosthenes, in addition to calculating the Earth's circumference, wrote geographical treatises that attempted to map the known world accurately. Strabo, writing around the turn of the Common Era, compiled a massive geography that drew on centuries of earlier work. Other geographers whose names we know wrote works that are now entirely lost. The geographical knowledge of the ancient world was fragmentary and sometimes inaccurate, but it was the best available, and it was continuously improving as new information came in from travellers, merchants, and military expeditions. When this tradition was broken, geographical knowledge declined. Medieval European maps were less accurate than ancient ones, showing a world that was more a theological diagram than a representation of physical reality. The recovery of ancient geographical texts in the Renaissance helped spark the age of exploration, as Europeans realized that the world was larger and more complex than their medieval predecessors had believed. The historical works lost at Alexandria represent yet another dimension of the catastrophe. Ancient historians wrote detailed accounts of events and periods that we now know only through fragments and summaries. They had access to sources and witnesses that were available to no one else. Their works could have answered questions that we can now only speculate about. Consider the history of ancient Egypt. Manetho, a priest who lived in the 3rd century BCE, wrote a comprehensive history of Egypt from the earliest times to his own day. This work was based on temple records and traditions that went back thousands of years. It provided the framework for Egyptian chronology that we still use today, dividing Egyptian history into 30 dynasties. But we have only excerpts and summaries of Manetho's work preserved in quotations by later authors. The original, with all its details and documentation, is lost. What did Manetho say about the building of the pyramids? What records did he have access to? What events did he describe that his excerptors thought too unimportant to preserve? Consider the history of Alexander the Great himself. Several of his companions wrote accounts of his campaigns based on first-hand experience. These accounts were available in the Library of Alexandria and were used by later historians who compiled the narratives that survive today. But the original accounts are lost. We read Alexander's history through several layers of compilation and interpretation unable to access the primary sources that might give us a more direct view. The pattern repeats across every field of ancient knowledge. What survives is a fraction of what existed. What we know is a shadow of what was known. The Library of Alexandria contained the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world, and most of it is gone forever. The psychological impact of the library's destruction on subsequent generations deserves consideration as well. When people in later centuries looked back at Alexandria, they saw a golden age of learning that had been lost, a height from which civilization had fallen. This perception shaped how they understood their own situation and their possibilities for the future. For medieval scholars, the ancient world represented a standard of achievement that seemed almost unattainable. The ancients had built monuments that still stood, written works of philosophy and literature that could not be equalled, made scientific discoveries that seemed almost miraculous. Medieval Europe, by comparison, felt diminished, a civilization living in the ruins of something greater. This sense of loss and diminishment was psychologically complex. On one hand, it could inspire humility and reverence for the achievements of the past. On the other hand, it could inspire efforts to recover and eventually surpass those achievements. The Renaissance, which sought to revive ancient learning, and the scientific revolution, which sought to extend it, were both responses to the perception that knowledge had been lost and needed to be regained. The idea of progress, so central to modern Western thought, emerged partly in response to the experience of recovery from loss. If knowledge could decline and then be rebuilt, if civilization could fall and then rise again, then perhaps it was possible to eventually exceed what had come before. The catastrophe of Alexandria became paradoxically a source of hope. If so much had been lost, then so much could be discovered. If the ancients had achieved so much, then perhaps we could achieve even more. This psychological dynamic continues to shape how we think about knowledge and progress. We measure our achievements against the ancient standard. We celebrate discoveries that would have amazed the Alexandrian scholars. We worry about the fragility of our own institutions and the possibility that we too might lose what we have gained. The library haunts our collective memory, a reminder of what can be achieved and what can be lost. The counterfactual question of what might have been if the library had survived is impossible to answer with certainty, but it is worth exploring. History does not allow controlled experiments. We cannot rerun the past with different initial conditions and see how things would have turned out. But we can consider the possibilities, recognizing that they are speculative while still taking them seriously. Imagine that the Library of Alexandria had survived intact through the centuries. Imagine that the fires had not happened. The religious conflicts had not destroyed the Serapeum. The various periods of neglect had been avoided. Imagine that the translation movements had access to the complete collection rather than the fragments that actually survived. What might have been different? The most direct impact would have been on the continuity of scientific and scholarly traditions. Each generation of scholars could have started from where the previous one left off, building on foundations that had been carefully laid and preserved. The breaks in transmission that occurred when Alexandria fell would not have happened. The centuries of rediscovery that followed would not have been necessary. Consider astronomy. If Aristarchus's heliocentric model had been available continuously, along with the observations and arguments that supported it, astronomers might have developed the correct understanding of the solar system much earlier. The complex epicyclic models that Ptolemy and his successors developed to explain planetary motions within a geocentric framework might never have been necessary. The conceptual breakthrough that Copernicus represented might have happened centuries earlier. Consider medicine. If the anatomical discoveries of Herophilus and Erasistratus had been transmitted continuously, physicians might have had accurate knowledge of the human body throughout the medieval period. The errors and superstitions that characterize medieval medicine might have been avoided. Treatments might have been more effective, and lives might have been saved. Consider mathematics. If the full tradition of Greek mathematics had been available continuously, the development of calculus and modern analysis might have happened earlier. The foundations that Newton and Leibniz laid in the 17th century might have been laid in the 12th or 13th century by scholars building directly on Archimedes and Apollonius, rather than having to rediscover their work. Consider engineering. The practical knowledge preserved in Alexandrian treatises, the accumulated experience of centuries of building and invention, might have been available to medieval engineers. The technological regression that followed the fall of Rome might have been avoided or minimized. The Industrial Revolution, which depended on accumulated technical knowledge, might have happened earlier. These speculations are not meant to suggest that history would have followed any particular alternative path. There are many reasons why the ancient world did not develop technologies that later generations did. The availability of slave labor reduced the incentive to develop labor-saving machinery. The economic and social structures of ancient societies may not have been conducive to certain kinds of innovation. The scientific method as we understand it had not yet been fully developed. The mere preservation of texts would not have guaranteed continued progress, but the loss of those texts certainly hindered progress. The knowledge that was destroyed had to be painstakingly recovered, a process that took centuries. The institutional frameworks that had supported scholarship at Alexandria had to be rebuilt in different forms. The communities of scholars who could understand and extend ancient knowledge had to be reconstituted. All of this took time and effort that could have been devoted to new discoveries if the old ones had been preserved. The specific estimate of how much time was lost varies among historians. Some have suggested that the destruction of the library and the subsequent Dark Ages set Western civilization back by about 1,000 years. Others argue that this estimate is too high, that other factors would have prevented rapid progress even if the library had survived. Still others argue that the estimate is too low, that the full impact of the loss can never be calculated. What seems clear is that the loss was real and significant. The world would be different today if the Library of Alexandria had survived. We would know more, understand more, have capabilities that we currently lack. The trajectory of human civilization would have been altered in ways that we can only dimly imagine. This recognition should inform how we think about knowledge preservation today. The decisions we make about funding libraries and archives, about maintaining digital infrastructure, about supporting scholarship and education, have long-term consequences that extend far beyond our own lifetimes. We are shaping the intellectual inheritance that future generations will receive. We can choose to invest in preservation and transmission, or we can allow knowledge to be lost through neglect and destruction. The choice is ours. The experience of Alexandria shows what is at stake. The question of blame for the library's destruction has occupied historians and polemicists for centuries. Different groups have pointed fingers at different culprits, often motivated as much by contemporary concerns as by historical evidence. Understanding these debates reveals how the library has been used as a symbol in broader cultural and religious conflicts. The blame assigned to Julius Caesar reflects anxieties about military power and its relationship to culture. Caesar was a conqueror who destroyed in order to win. His fire in Alexandria's harbour, whether intentional or accidental, represents the threat that military necessity poses to cultural achievements. Those who emphasize Caesar's role are often making a broader point about the dangers of war and the need to protect cultural heritage from military destruction. The blame assigned to Christians reflects tensions between religious faith and secular learning. The destruction of the Serapeum under Theophilus, the murder of Hypatia, the suppression of pagan philosophy and science, all of these events have been used to argue that Christianity was hostile to knowledge and bears responsibility for the loss of ancient learning. This narrative was particularly popular during the Enlightenment, when thinkers critical of religious authority used Alexandria as an example of the damage that religious zealotry could cause. The blame assigned to Muslim conquerors reflects different tensions, often related to conflicts between Christian and Islamic civilizations. The story of Caliph Omar ordering the books burned because they either agreed or disagreed with the Quran became popular in contexts where Christians wanted to portray Islam as hostile to learning. The fact that this story is almost certainly false has not prevented its continued circulation among those who find it useful. The historical reality is more complex than any of these simple narratives. The library's destruction was not the work of any single group or event. It was a gradual process that unfolded over centuries, involving many different actors and causes. Fire, war, religious conflict, political instability, economic decline, simple neglect, all played roles. Assigning blame to any single culprit oversimplifies a complex historical process. Moreover, the different groups blamed for the destruction also played roles in preserving what survived. Christian monks copied and preserved classical texts in their monasteries. Muslim scholars translated Greek works into Arabic and extended their contents. Roman administrators maintained institutions of learning before their empire collapsed. Even those who participated in destruction sometimes also participated in preservation, and even those who valued learning sometimes made decisions that led to loss. The lesson of this complexity is that preservation requires constant effort from many different people and institutions. There is no single guardian of knowledge who can be trusted to protect everything. The survival of texts depends on redundancy, on multiple copies in multiple locations maintained by multiple communities with different interests and values. When this redundancy fails, when knowledge comes to depend on a single institution or tradition, it becomes vulnerable to the kind of catastrophic loss that Alexandria represents. This is why the modern system of libraries, archives, and digital repositories is so important. No single institution can be trusted to preserve everything, but a distributed system, with many institutions maintaining overlapping collections, can survive the loss of any single node. The knowledge stored in the Library of Congress is also stored in other libraries around the world. The knowledge on any single website is likely to be replicated on other servers. This redundancy is not perfect, and important materials are still lost every day. But it is a better system than the ancient world had, and it exists because we learned from the ancient world's failures. The emotional resonance of the Library of Alexandria persists because it speaks to something deep in human nature. We love knowledge. We want to understand the world. We fear that what we have learned might be lost, that our efforts might be forgotten, that the progress we have made might be undone. The library represents both our highest aspirations and our deepest fears. The aspiration is to gather all human knowledge, to create an institution that preserves and extends understanding across generations, to build something that will last and benefit those who come after us. This aspiration is visible today in projects like Wikipedia, which attempts to create a comprehensive encyclopedia available to everyone, and in digital preservation efforts that seek to ensure that the records of our civilization survive into the distant future. The fear is that it could all be lost, that the institutions we have built could fail, that the knowledge we have accumulated could be forgotten, that we could find ourselves in a new dark age, having to rediscover what was once known, making mistakes that could have been avoided if we had learned from the past. This fear is visible in anxieties about digital obsolescence, about the vulnerability of electronic records, about the possibility that future generations might not be able to access the information we are creating today. The Library of Alexandria serves as both inspiration and warning. It shows what can be achieved when a civilization commits to knowledge preservation. It shows what can be lost when that commitment fails. It challenges us to consider whether we're doing enough to ensure that our own knowledge survives, and it reminds us that the question is never finally settled. Each generation must make its own commitment to preservation, or risk losing what previous generations have given us. The emotional power of the library story is amplified by uncertainty. We do not know exactly what was lost. We can only glimpse fragments, references, tantalizing hints of knowledge that no longer exists. This uncertainty allows us to imagine the loss as enormous, perhaps even greater than it actually was. The unknown becomes a canvas for our fears and regrets, a space where we can project our own anxieties about the fragility of human achievement. Some historians caution against romanticizing the library, pointing out that it was an institution of elite scholarship, inaccessible to ordinary people, supported by a monarchy that was often oppressive. They note that knowledge preservation has always been selective, that choices about what to preserve have reflected the biases and interests of those making the decisions. They argue that we should not idealize the ancient library, but should instead work to create more democratic and inclusive institutions of knowledge in our own time. These cautions are valid, but they do not diminish the tragedy of the loss. Whatever limitations the ancient library had, it preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost entirely. Whatever biases shaped its collection, that collection contained works of permanent value that benefited later generations. The imperfections of the institution do not negate the significance of its destruction. We can acknowledge the library's limitations while still mourning what was lost. We can learn from its failures while still honouring its achievements. We can use its story to inspire better institutions in our own time, institutions that are more inclusive, more resilient, more committed to serving all of humanity. The Library of Alexandria does not need to be perfect to be important. It needs only to remind us of what is at stake when we make decisions about knowledge preservation. The final lesson of Alexandria is about time and responsibility. The library existed for roughly 6 centuries, from its founding around 300 BCE to its effective end sometime in the first few centuries CE. During that time, countless individuals made decisions that affected its survival. Some chose to support it, some chose to neglect it, Some chose to destroy it. The cumulative effect of these decisions determined the library's fate. We are making similar decisions today, usually without recognizing their significance. Every time a library is underfunded, every time an archive is neglected, every time a digital format becomes obsolete, every time a conflict destroys cultural heritage, we are participating in the same process that destroyed Alexandria. The individual decisions may seem small. The cumulative effect can be catastrophic. The responsibility is diffuse but real. It belongs to governments that set budgets for cultural institutions. It belongs to institutions that make decisions about what to preserve and how. It belongs to individuals who choose whether to support these efforts. It belongs to all of us who benefit from the knowledge that has been transmitted to us and who have an obligation to transmit it to those who come after. The timescales involved are longer than human lifetimes. The Library of Alexandria accumulated its collection over generations. Its destruction unfolded over centuries. The recovery of what survived took even longer. We who live in a given moment see only a snapshot of processes that extend far into the past and future. Our decisions have consequences that we will never see, affecting people who will never know our names. This is both daunting and inspiring. Daunting because we cannot know the full effects of what we do. Inspiring because we are part of something larger than ourselves, a chain of transmission that connects us to the ancient scholars of Alexandria and to the unknown generations of the future. Our efforts matter, even if we cannot measure exactly how much. Our failures matter too. The work of preservation never ends. It must be renewed by each generation, or the chain will break. The Library of Alexandria warns us what happens when it breaks. The modern world shows us what is possible when it holds. The choice of whether to maintain it belongs to us. This is the message that Alexandria sends across the centuries. This is the responsibility that falls on everyone who values knowledge. This is the commitment that we must make if we want our own achievements to survive. The ancient librarians could not have known what would happen to their institution. They worked and preserved and transmitted, trusting that their efforts would matter, not knowing that most of what they saved would eventually be lost. We are in a similar position. We work and preserve and transmit, trusting that our efforts matter, not knowing what the future will bring. We can only do what is in our power and hope that it will be enough. The Library of Alexandria is gone. But the work of preservation continues. It continues in libraries and archives around the world. It continues in digital preservation projects. It continues in the education of new generations of scholars and librarians and archivists. It continues whenever someone makes the choice to save knowledge rather than let it be lost. It continues in you, listening to this story, thinking about what it means, considering what you might do to help maintain the chain of transmission that connects us all. The night is long, and the story of Alexandria is part of the longer story of human knowledge, its accumulation and loss, its preservation and destruction, its transmission across generations and civilizations. We are all part of this story. We are all responsible for how it continues. We are all connected to the ancient scholars who built the library and to the future generations who will inherit what we preserve or lose what we neglect. Let that thought settle into your mind as you drift towards sleep. The library is gone, but its spirit endures in everyone who loves knowledge and works to preserve it. You are part of that spirit. You are part of the story. You are part of the chain that stretches back to Alexandria and forward into the unknown future. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's greatest tragedies and one of its most enduring legacies. The library burned, but libraries still exist. The knowledge was lost, but knowledge continues to grow. The dream was shattered, but dreams can be renewed. Rest well tonight. Dream of scrolls and scholars, of fire and survival, of all the knowledge that was lost and all the knowledge that endures. Tomorrow is another day to learn, to preserve, to transmit, to continue the work that the ancient librarians began more than 2,000 years ago. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but its story will never be forgotten. Good night. The physical experience of the ancient library deserves our imagination, because understanding what it was like to work there helps us appreciate what was lost when it fell. We have scattered descriptions from ancient sources, archaeological evidence from similar institutions, and educated guesses based on how ancient scholarship functioned. From these fragments, we can reconstruct something of the sensory reality of the greatest library the ancient world ever knew. Imagine walking through the streets of ancient Alexandria, toward the Brucheum, the royal quarter where the Museion and library stood. You would pass through a city of perhaps 500,000 people, one of the largest and most cosmopolitan in the ancient world. The streets would be crowded with merchants, sailors, scholars, slaves, priests, and officials speaking a dozen languages. The architecture would be magnificent, combining Greek elegance with Egyptian grandeur, the buildings constructed of white limestone that gleamed in the Mediterranean sun. As you approached the Museion complex, the character of your surroundings would change. The noise and bustle of the commercial districts would give way to quieter, more orderly spaces. Gardens and colonnades would provide shade and contemplation. You might see scholars walking together in discussion, continuing debates that had begun in the lecture halls or reading rooms. The atmosphere would be intellectual, privileged, removed from the concerns of ordinary life. The library itself would not be a single building, but a complex of structures designed for different purposes. Storage rooms would hold the hundreds of thousands of scrolls that comprise the collection, organized in bins or on shelves according to a system developed over generations. Reading rooms would provide spaces where scholars could consult materials without removing them from the premises. Copying rooms would house the scribes who produced new scrolls to replace worn ones, or to be sold and traded to other institutions. The scrolls themselves would be made of papyrus, a material produced from reeds that grew along the Nile. They would be rolled around wooden or ivory rods, with tags attached indicating the author and title. To read a scroll, you would unroll it with one hand while rolling up the portion you had already read with the other, a process that required some skill and made quick reference difficult. The scrolls would be fragile, vulnerable to moisture, insects, fire, and simple wear from handling. The smell of the library would be distinctive, a combination of papyrus, ink, dust, and the oil used in lamps. The light would be natural during the day, streaming through windows and doorways, supplemented by oil lamps when the sun set or when scholars worked in interior rooms. The temperature would be moderate in the Mediterranean climate, though summers could be hot and winters occasionally cool. The sounds would be those of scholarship, the quiet scratching of reed pens on papyrus, the murmur of voices reading aloud, since silent reading was unusual in the ancient world, the footsteps of library staff retrieving and reshelving scrolls. As a scholar working at the Museion, you would have access to resources that existed nowhere else. You could read the collected works of philosophers from Thales to the present day. You could study mathematical treatises that represented the accumulated discoveries of centuries. You could consult historical records and geographical descriptions from across the known world. You could access texts in multiple languages, including works that had been translated specifically to make them available to Greek-speaking scholars. The community of scholars would be both stimulating and competitive. Your peers would include some of the finest minds of the age, people who had devoted their lives to pursuing knowledge. You would eat with them in the common dining hall, debate with them in the gardens and porticos, compete with them for recognition and royal favour. Friendships and rivalries would develop, some lasting decades, some ending in bitter conflict. Your work would be supported by royal patronage that freed you from economic concerns, but also made you dependent on the continuing favour of rulers whose priorities might change. The Ptolemies valued scholarship, but they valued it for their own reasons, some intellectual and some political. You would need to navigate these political realities while pursuing your research, a challenge familiar to scholars in every era. The library was not a democratic institution. Access was restricted to scholars who had been accepted into the Museion community or who had obtained special permission. Ordinary citizens of Alexandria could not simply walk in and browse the collection. The knowledge stored there was available only to a privileged few, though the discoveries made by those few would eventually benefit everyone. The work of scholarship in this environment was painstaking and slow. There were no shortcuts, no search engines, no databases. If you wanted to find everything written on a particular topic, you had to consult the Pinax catalogue and then request each relevant scroll individually. If you wanted to compare different versions of a text, you had to have multiple scrolls open simultaneously, a physical challenge given the unwieldy nature of the format. If you wanted to share your findings with a colleague in another city, you had to arrange for a copy to be made and physically transported. These limitations shaped the nature of ancient scholarship. It tended to be comprehensive rather than specialized, because a scholar who had made the effort to access a particular set of sources would try to extract everything of value from them rather than pursuing narrow questions. It tended to be synthetic rather than original, because the primary task was often to organise and preserve existing knowledge rather than to make new discoveries. It tended to be slow and careful, because errors could propagate indefinitely once a text was copied and circulated. The library functioned as the memory of civilization, storing knowledge so that it would not have to be rediscovered by each generation. This function was both its greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. As long as the library existed and was maintained, the knowledge was safe. But if the library fell, the knowledge fell with it, and there was no backup, no distributed system, no cloud storage to preserve what was lost. The scholars who worked at Alexandria surely understood this vulnerability. They must have worried about fire, about war, about the possibility that political changes might cut off the resources needed to maintain the collection. They must have taken precautions, copying particularly valuable texts, sending copies to other libraries, trying to ensure that the most important knowledge existed in multiple places. But no precautions were sufficient. The library fell anyway, and most of what it contained was lost. The human experience of this loss is difficult to imagine from our perspective. Scholars who had spent their lives building on the work of their predecessors suddenly found that their foundations had been destroyed. Research programs that had extended across generations were cut off. Communities of inquiry that had sustained themselves for centuries were dispersed and broken. The intellectual world that had seemed permanent and secure revealed itself to be fragile and temporary. Some scholars must have tried to save what they could, carrying texts with them as they fled, or hiding precious scrolls in hopes of returning for them later. Some of these efforts succeeded, which is why we have fragments and copies of works that would otherwise have been completely lost. But most efforts failed, overwhelmed by the scale of destruction and the chaos of the times. The emotional experience of watching centuries of accumulated knowledge burn or decay must have been devastating for those who understood what was being lost. They were witnessing the destruction of their life's work, their predecessors' work, the collective achievement of countless scholars over hundreds of years. They were watching the light of the ancient world go out, knowing that the darkness that followed might last for generations. We can only imagine their grief and their desperate efforts to preserve what little they could. The legacy of the Library of Alexandria extends beyond the specific knowledge it contained to the idea it represented. The concept of a universal library, an institution that gathers and preserves all human knowledge, has inspired scholars and dreamers for more than 2,000 years. This concept keeps being reinvented in new forms as technology and society change. From medieval monasteries to national libraries to the internet, the monastic libraries of medieval Europe were conscious heirs of the Alexandrian tradition, at least in aspiration if not in scale. Monks who copied manuscripts understood themselves as preserving the heritage of the ancient world for future generations. They developed systems for organizing and cataloging their collections. They created networks through which texts could be borrowed, copied, and returned. They maintained the chain of transmission that eventually allowed classical knowledge to reach the modern world. The great national libraries of the early modern period took up the Alexandrian ideal, with new resources and new ambitions. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France, founded in the 14th century and expanded dramatically in subsequent centuries, sought to collect everything published in the French language and much that was published elsewhere. The British Library, emerging from the collections of the British Museum, developed similarly comprehensive ambitions. The Library of Congress, beginning as a legislative reference library, grew into one of the largest libraries in the world, with a collection that approaches the ideal of universality that Alexandria first established. The digital age has given new form to the Alexandrian dream. Projects like Google Books have attempted to digitize every book ever published, making them searchable and accessible to anyone with an internet connection. The Internet Archive has sought to preserve the entire World Wide Web, capturing snapshots of websites so that future historians can understand our digital culture. Wikipedia has created a comprehensive encyclopedia written collaboratively by volunteers, available in hundreds of languages to anyone who wants to consult it. These projects are the modern heirs of Alexandria, pursuing the same dream of universal access to knowledge with technologies that the ancient librarians could never have imagined. But they face the same challenges that Alexandria faced: the challenge of funding, the challenge of organization, the challenge of selection, the challenge of preservation over time. Google Books has been entangled in legal disputes over copyright. The Internet Archive operates on a shoestring budget, constantly seeking donations to continue its work. Wikipedia struggles with accuracy, bias, and the challenge of maintaining quality as its scope expands. Digital formats create new vulnerabilities. Software becomes obsolete within years. Hardware fails and must be replaced. Data can be corrupted, hacked, or accidentally deleted. The permanence that we associate with digital storage is largely an illusion. Digital information must be actively maintained and migrated to new formats, or it will become inaccessible as surely as a papyrus scroll that has crumbled to dust. The Library of Alexandria lasted for roughly 6 centuries before its effective end. We do not yet know how long our digital libraries will last. The technologies are too new for us to have long-term experience with them. The institutions that maintain digital archives are still developing the practices and resources needed to ensure long-term survival. We are conducting an experiment whose results will not be known for generations. The dream of Alexandria persists because it speaks to a fundamental human desire, the desire to know and to preserve what we know, to build on the achievements of the past rather than starting over with each generation, to leave something lasting for those who come after us. This desire is not merely practical, it is also deeply emotional, connected to our awareness of mortality and our hope that something of ourselves will survive. The scholars who built the Library of Alexandria are long dead, but their dream lives on in everyone who works to preserve and transmit knowledge. The librarians and archivists who maintain our collections, the scholars who study and interpret ancient texts, the technologists who develop systems for preserving digital information, the teachers who pass knowledge to new generations of students, the writers who record what they have learned for those who will come after. All of these people are continuing the work that began at Alexandria more than 2,000 years ago. The fire that destroyed the library has never stopped burning. It burns today in every budget cut to a library or archive. It burns in every digital file that becomes inaccessible due to format obsolescence. It burns in every conflict that destroys cultural heritage. It burns in every act of censorship that removes knowledge from circulation. The work of preservation is never finished because the forces of destruction are never defeated, but the work continues nonetheless. It continues because the knowledge is worth preserving. It continues because the alternative, a world where each generation must start from scratch, is too terrible to accept. It continues because the dream of Alexandria, the dream of gathering all human knowledge and making it available to all who seek it, is a dream worth pursuing even if it can never be fully achieved. The library is gone, but the dream endures, and as long as the dream endures, the spirit of Alexandria lives on. The night has grown very long now, and we have travelled together through more than 2 millennia of history and loss, and recovery and hope. We have walked the halls of the greatest library the ancient world ever knew. We have met the scholars who worked there and glimpsed the discoveries they made. We have watched the slow destruction of what they built and the long effort to recover what was lost. We have considered what it all means for us today. The Library of Alexandria was a miracle of human achievement. In an age before printing, before digital technology, before any of the tools we take for granted, people built an institution that gathered the accumulated knowledge of civilization and made it available to those who sought it. They created systems for organizing and preserving this knowledge. They developed methods of scholarship that we still use today. They pushed the boundaries of human understanding in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and countless other fields, and it was destroyed, slowly over centuries through fire and war and neglect and the changing priorities of those who controlled its fate. The knowledge was scattered and lost. The scholars were dispersed and killed. The institution was dismantled until nothing remained but fragments and memories. We live today in the shadow of that loss. The knowledge that survived has shaped everything we know and do. The knowledge that was lost is gone forever, inaccessible to us and to all future generations. We can never know exactly what we lost, but we know that it was immense, centuries of accumulated wisdom vanishing into smoke and dust. This is the tragedy of Alexandria. But there is also hope in the story. The knowledge that survived did so because people made choices to preserve it. Monks copied manuscripts. Muslim scholars translated texts. Refugees carried books with them as they fled. At every stage, individuals decided that knowledge was worth saving, and their decisions made the difference between survival and loss. We face the same choices today. We can choose to preserve and transmit what we know, or we can allow it to be lost through neglect and destruction. The decision is not made once but continuously, in the countless small choices that determine whether knowledge survives. Every time we support a library, every time we fund an archive, every time we teach someone something true, we are choosing preservation over loss. The Library of Alexandria cannot be rebuilt. What was lost cannot be recovered. But we can honour its legacy by building libraries of our own, by preserving the knowledge of our own age, by ensuring that future generations do not suffer the same losses that we have suffered. This is the responsibility that falls on all of us. This is the lesson that Alexandria teaches across the centuries. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, carry with you the memory of Alexandria, the scholars who walked its halls, the scrolls that lined its shelves, the light of knowledge that burned there for 600 years. Carry with you the grief for what was lost and the gratitude for what survived. Carry with you the determination to do better, to preserve more, to transmit the inheritance of knowledge to those who will come after us. The library is gone, but libraries still exist. The knowledge was lost, but knowledge continues to grow. The fire burned, but the flame of learning was not entirely extinguished, and it burns still in everyone who loves knowledge and seeks to preserve it. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through the rise and fall of the greatest library in the ancient world. If you enjoyed this exploration, please subscribe so you don't miss the next voyage into forgotten history. If you have thoughts about Alexandria, about knowledge preservation, about what we have lost and what we might yet lose, leave a comment. And if you found yourself drifting towards sleep during this long meditation on the fragility and resilience of human knowledge, that is exactly what these stories are for. Rest well tonight. Dream of scrolls and scholars, of fire and survival, of all that was lost and all that endures. Tomorrow the work continues, the work of learning, preserving, transmitting, continuing the chain that stretches back to Alexandria and forward into the unknown future. The Library of Alexandria is gone, but its spirit lives on in everyone who loves knowledge and works to preserve it. That spirit lives in you. Good night. Before we close, there are a few more threads to gather, a few more aspects of this ancient tragedy that deserve our attention. The story of the Library of Alexandria is inexhaustible, and even after hours of exploration, we have only scratched the surface of what might be said. But some final thoughts will help complete the picture we have been building together. The relationship between the library and the city that housed it reminds us that knowledge does not exist in isolation. The library was possible because Alexandria was a wealthy trading hub that could support intellectual activity. It was possible because the Ptolemaic rulers chose to invest in cultural prestige. It was possible because scholars from across the Mediterranean world were willing to come to Egypt and contribute to the project. When the city declined, when the economy weakened, when political instability made Alexandria a less attractive destination, the library declined with it. We see similar patterns today. The greatest universities and research centres are located in wealthy cities that can support them. When cities decline economically, their cultural institutions often decline as well. The relationship between knowledge and wealth, between culture and power, remains as relevant today as it was in ancient times. The religious dimension of the library's destruction continues to be debated. Some see the rise of Christianity as a major factor in the loss of classical knowledge. Others point out that Christian scholars preserved much of what survived, and that Christian institutions maintained the chain of transmission through the medieval period. The truth is probably that Christianity had both destructive and preservative effects, at different times and in different places, and that any simple narrative of religious persecution destroying classical learning is inadequate to the complexity of what actually happened. The role of accident in the library's fate deserves acknowledgement. So much depended on contingent events, fires that might not have started, decisions that might have gone differently, individuals who happened to copy one text rather than another. History is full of such contingencies, moments when the course of events turned on factors that could easily have been different. The library's destruction was not inevitable. It was the result of specific choices and specific events that might not have occurred. This recognition of contingency has implications for how we think about our own situation. The survival of our knowledge into the future is not guaranteed. It depends on choices we make, on events we cannot predict, on factors we may not even recognize as important. The library reminds us that civilizations can lose what they have built, that progress can be reversed, that we cannot assume our achievements will survive. The international dimension of the library's collection and its community of scholars offers another lesson. The library gathered knowledge from across the known world. Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, Jewish, and Greek traditions all contributed to its collection. Scholars came from distant lands to study and teach there. The library was cosmopolitan in a way that transcended the boundaries of any single culture or nation. This cosmopolitanism was essential to the library's greatness. No single culture possessed all knowledge. By bringing different traditions together, the library created possibilities for synthesis and discovery that would have been impossible in isolation. The insights that emerged from Alexandria were products of cultural mixing, of ideas encountering ideas across boundaries of language and tradition. Today we face pressures toward intellectual isolation, toward national or cultural boundaries that restrict the flow of knowledge. The lesson of Alexandria is that these boundaries impoverish us all. Knowledge grows best when it can flow freely, when scholars from different traditions can learn from each other, when the accumulated wisdom of all humanity is accessible to anyone who seeks it. The library's emphasis on preservation alongside creation also deserves reflection. The scholars of Alexandria did not just create new knowledge, they also devoted enormous effort to preserving and organizing what already existed. They understood that knowledge not preserved is knowledge lost, that the achievements of the past must be maintained if they are to serve as foundations for the future. In our own time, we often emphasize innovation over preservation, the new over the old, the discovery over the inheritance. But the library reminds us that preservation is equally important. Every generation stands on the shoulders of those who came before. If we fail to preserve their achievements, we condemn our descendants to start over from the beginning. The library's ultimate destruction, despite the best efforts of many generations of librarians and scholars, reminds us that preservation is never guaranteed. We can do everything right and still fail. We can take every precaution and still suffer catastrophic loss. This is not a reason to despair, but a reason for humility, for recognizing that our efforts are necessary but not sufficient, that we do what we can while acknowledging that the outcome is not entirely in our control. The memory of Alexandria continues to serve important functions in our culture. It reminds us of what is at stake when we make decisions about knowledge and preservation. It provides a reference point for discussions about the value of libraries and the importance of cultural heritage. It connects us to a past that shaped everything we are and know. As long as we remember Alexandria, we remember that knowledge is precious and fragile, that it can be lost as well as gained, that the work of preservation must be renewed by each generation. This memory is itself a kind of preservation, keeping alive the awareness that motivated the ancient librarians, and that must motivate us as well. The story of the Library of Alexandria does not have a happy ending. The library was destroyed. Most of what it contained was lost forever. The centuries that followed saw periods of darkness and regression that might have been avoided if the knowledge had survived. This is the tragedy, and we should not minimize it or pretend that it does not matter, but tragedy can be instructive. We can learn from what went wrong, we can resolve to do better. We can honor those who tried to preserve knowledge by continuing their work in our own time. The library's destruction can motivate us to work harder for preservation, to invest more in our own libraries and archives, to ensure that we do not inflict the same losses on future generations. The story ends, but the lessons continue. The library is gone, but the dream lives on. The knowledge was lost, but knowledge continues to grow. We are the heirs of Alexandria, whether we recognize it or not. We carry forward the work that began there more than 2,000 years ago. And as long as we continue that work, as long as we preserve and transmit and extend what we know, the spirit of Alexandria endures. The night is ending now. The story has been told. The library has been remembered, its achievements honoured, its destruction mourned, its lessons drawn. What remains is for you to carry these lessons with you, to think about what they mean, to consider what you might do to help maintain the chain of transmission that connects us all. The Library of Alexandria was the greatest library the ancient world ever knew. It was a beacon of light in an age that had few such beacons. Its destruction was a catastrophe whose effects we still feel today. But the dream it represented, the dream of gathering all human knowledge and preserving it for future generations, that dream belongs to all of us now. It is our responsibility to pursue it. Thank you for spending this time with me. exploring one of history's greatest achievements and one of its greatest losses. May the story of Alexandria inspire you to value knowledge, to support those who work to preserve it, and to do what you can to ensure that our own age's achievements survive for those who will come after us. The library burned, but the flame of learning was not extinguished. It burns still in libraries and universities and archives around the world. It burns in everyone who loves knowledge and seeks to preserve it. It burns in you. Carry that flame forward. Honour the memory of Alexandria. Continue the work that began there more than 2,000 years ago. The library is gone, but its spirit lives on. Good night.